and swept a hand toward her table of goods. "Interested in my tonics, young master?" Gold bracelets jangled at her wrists as she stood and joined him. Her dark hair was pulled back and wrapped beneath a red scarf. "I have everything you need to keep you young and handsome, and others to make you tall and strong. I have no interest in tonics intended for appearance," Alton said firmly before turning away. "Wait!" the woman cried, and reached beneath the table. She withdrew a leather pouch and unraveled the string. "You are interested in medicinal tonics, yes?" She revealed a dozen glass vials, each containing a different color liquid. Alton stepped closer. "What are they used for?" "This one." Smell. The woman uncorked the first vial and gave it a firm sniff, before holding it toward him. Alton gave it a gentle sniff before nodding. "Eucalyptus and mint, good for the breath. And this one here, cinnamon and frankincense, very expensive, very hard to obtain," she said in a lowered voice. "But good for immunity." Alton listened while she explained each of the vials. They weren't fake, that much he was certain, especially when she offered the price. Real essential oils took time to curate from plants, and they often came from other parts of the world far, far from here, let alone the archipelago. The vials containing frankincense and myrrh and juniper, those especially were difficult and highly expensive. He thought of Inga back home. The healers of Burke used many herbs and tonics for healing, most of which were based on natural resources from the island, but the world was learning more and more about healing properties by the day. It would grow and learn without Burke. Unless that knowledge was taken to them. Unless Mara and Inga and the other healers could learn and study these other tonics themselves. Alton dug out a handful of gold coins from his satchel and handed them to the woman, who cupped them in her hands gratefully. "I'll take the whole pouch." "Thank you, young master," she said before wrapping up the pouch and handing it to him. "I trust you know how to use them, yes?" "Not me. A friend back home. She's a healer," Alton explained, setting the pouch into his satchel, careful not to jostle it. "I can't bring her here to learn, so I'll bring these to her." "Ah, but why can you not bring her here?" The woman's eyes glittered. "I trust a pretty girl would not say no to such a face." Alton choked on a laugh and adjusted the satchel on his shoulder. "Well, I don't know. I guess I'll have to ask her next time I'm home." "Yes, you do that, and you tell her that Maritza will not forget your kindness on this day. She is a lucky girl to have you." Alton thanked her and left the store, feeling strangely giddy after the conversation. He wasn't sure if it was Maritza's teasing or the fact that he'd bought something so special for Inga, but he had extra bounce to his step as he walked back to the ship. Johann's bird-like whistle echoed through the bowels of the ship as Alton finally boarded. "Hey, I'm back. Good haul today." "Ah, good, Master Alton," Johann called. "I had a nice haul myself. Another few days like this and we'll find ourselves set for the season." "Great." Alton took the ladder below and quickly stashed the pouch of vials in his room, careful to hide them in a safe place where they wouldn't break easily. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving." "Yes indeed, which is why I picked up something special," Johann said from the door with a leading edge to his voice, his hands behind his back. Alton turned. "Oh boy. What did you do? Come now, boy, did you honestly expect me to forget your 16th birthday?" Though he rolled his eyes, Alton tried not to smile. "Johann. Come, the old man revealed a thin piece of paper. "I must say I'm quite excited. Quite possibly the best gift I've ever given, which is saying something as the majority of my gift giving through my life has been quite fanciful." "Right," Alton said, straightening. He stared down at the fold of paper with his name written on it with waxed seal. "So I'm curious, do I eat it?" Johann blinked in confusion. Eat it?" "Yes, because I said I was starving, and you said yes indeed, which is why I picked up something special. I mean this is great, Johann, but it doesn't look very filling." "Clever boy. I suppose I got distracted in my excitement and failed to mention the stew bubbling away in the mess hall," Johann said, bouncing on his heels. "Ah, now that is exciting." Yes, but this," Johanna said, thrusting the paper into Alton's hands. "Oh, do go on, lad, before the gods take me, before I can fully enjoy this moment." "All right, All right, Alton said and opened the letter. He assumed it was a letter from his parents and sister, but to his surprise, it was a legal document. Ah! Johann's hands were clenched white, despite his excited grin. Go on. Alton raised a brow and began to read. I, Trader Johann, do wish that in the event of my retirement or unexpected death that all the entities of my trading business, including but not limited to ship, stock, finances. Alton's heart leaped into a gallop and he scanned the rest quickly. Should be left in the care of my apprentice, Alton Lee Brand. He stared up at Johann, who beamed with pride. What? It is my will, you see. Well, boy, it is no mystery to you that I am getting up in age. Why, I began this business nearly 40 years ago, when young Stoic the Vast took up the mantle as chief. Johann laughed. It has been my life's work to travel the seas, to discover new lands and help the archipelago to grow under the banner of friendship by way of sharing and trading our craftsmanship with others, and now to the world. I never would have dreamed we would have come so far 40 years later. But I must prepare for the inevitable, as all men do. Johann planted his arms on his hips. Now don't give me that look, I've still got a few years in these old bones. But His hands lowered and suddenly he looked emotional. Well, that is to say, I always wanted to travel the seas alone. But when it became apparent that I needed an apprentice, I never expected that such a bond would be created between us. Ah lad, you're like the son I never had. And I would be greatly honored if, when the time comes, you would continue the trading business. Stunned, Alton sank onto his bed. He barely heard the creak, barely heard anything save for the waves lapping against the walls. That is, Johann looked uncomfortable. If you want to, anyway. You may say no, of course. No. Alton interrupted. I mean, not that kind of no, I mean. Gods, this is so unexpected. I haven't. I never. You've never been so tongue-tied, that much is clear. Alton laughed. He shoved a hand through his hair and read the document again. Upon Johann's retirement or, though he hated the thought, his untimely death, he wanted Alton to take over the business. Are you sure? Alton asked. Surely there are more experienced traders out there. More experienced? Johann sputtered. Lad, you've been traveling with me for nearly 2 years. I've taught you everything I know from business transactions to opening new ports to sailing through hell or high water. I have faith in you, boy. A few short years ago I stubbornly hung on to the notion that I would ever need an apprentice, and of course I needed some convincing. But I wouldn't change it for the world, lad. Not for the world. Touched, Alton stood and embraced the old man. I would be honored. Thank you. No, lad, Johann said in a thick voice. Thank you. Alton pulled away, and suddenly felt quite light-headed. Oh boy, now what? Well, if you wish to sign it now, you can. Or, if you'd like to wait and discuss it with your family. No, I mean, Alton shrugged. No disrespect to them, of course, but I want this. Burke will always be home, but this. He looked around the humble cabin and listened to the wash of the waves against the hull. How could I turn this down? Johann slung an arm around Alton's shoulders and squeezed. I hoped you'd agree. Now let's fetch some supper. I do believe there may even be some leftover tarts from this morning, but we should get a celebratory drink in town. Alton grinned as Johann plunged into another spiel and led them down the hall. Suddenly, life had just gotten a whole lot bigger. The time had come. After years of talking about it, the time had finally come to decide who among them was the best, the smartest, the most inventive chef of them all. At long last, the Haddock versus Larson cook-off had begun. It was no secret that Finn and Eric each had a knack for cooking. They'd been surprising people for years with their affinity for baking, homemade stews and roasts and rolls, frying fish and even whole chickens, much to Tough Nut's dismay, and creating decadent chocolate desserts, much to the women's glee. It was finally decided, after a long argument over whose brownies were better, that a cook-off was in order. And it would happen on Snoggletok. Why they'd decided on Snoggletok, Hiccup didn't know, but it was proving interesting. And they'd accumulated a crowd. At first it was supposed to be at his house, after presents and a light lunch, Eric insisted, but as more and more people heard about the idea, the more it became apparent that they wanted to watch. Thus they were now gathered in the great hall. Finn and Eric each had a long table to themselves, covered in cooking utensils and a wicker basket. Other tables were spread throughout the hall, covered in fruits and vegetables, another for meats, another for liquids and oils and other cooking things that Hiccup didn't comprehend. Apparently this was a serious event, and Ben the baker and cook himself prided themselves on milking this for all it was worth. Hiccup himself sat at the council table, surrounded by a handful of friends, including his wife, who would apparently be the judges. There would be 3 trials: breakfast, dinner, and dessert. Hiccup, Astrid, fish legs, Snotlout and, to his endless surprise, Lara Larson would decide the boys' fate. Who was the ultimate chef on Berk? "All right then," Gobber said, raising his voice above the excited voices in the hall. "As we all know, there will be 3 rounds. Breakfast, dinner, and dessert. Each chef." "Yes, dear." Inga lowered her hand, lips pursed. "These 2 aren't real chefs, you know. They are self-taught, but they haven't made it their life's work." "Hey." Finn frowned. "My cookies are still better than yours. And I'm still prettier than you, Haddock." Yes, Gobber waved a hand. "But good looks won't win this competition. Only true wit and innovation can wield tasty results, and only the panel can decide who is the winner. Behold, the wicker baskets in front of each contestant. Go ahead and open them up, boys." Eric and Finn each opened their baskets and paused. "What the bloody hell is that?" Finn asked. Eric only smirked and began pulling items out of his basket. A strange green and pink fruit with what appeared to be leaves flaring out, a few potatoes, a jar of something brown with ridges, and a sleeve of crackers. The crowd stirred in confusion until Gobber raised his voice again. "As you see here, we have made this competition a little more complicated. Each round contains a basket of random items. Here you see a jar of walnuts, sturdy Burkean potatoes, dry crackers, and dragon fruit, courtesy of Miss Sullivan." "What?" Finn hissed and stared at Genevieve, who grinned from her seat nearby. "You did this? How could you?" Genevieve shrugged. "We had to shake things up. Both competitors must use all ingredients provided in the baskets," Gobber continued. "And may use any other ingredients in the Great Hall to supplement their dishes. Our esteemed judges will decide who is the best. You will have 30 minutes to make your breakfast dish, gentlemen." Even Eric's brows shot up at that. "Wait. We're timed. What, did you think this was going to be easy?" But. Finn lifted the dragon fruit. "I've never even heard of this before. How are we?" "Time starts now." Gobber roared and slammed his mallet arm into the gong at his side. The crowd burst into cheers and laughs as the boys each leaped into action. Eric sprinted for the table of fruits, his brow pinched with concentration. He grabbed a handful of fruits and sprinted to another table full of condiments, but Hiccup wasn't sure what he planned to grab. His own cooking skills ended at popcorn. Finn, meanwhile, swore under his breath and hacked the dragon fruit in half with a knife. It had white flesh with black seeds dotted throughout. He stared at it for a moment before grabbing a spoon and glaring at his girlfriend. "I swear. Oh, don't be a baby, it's no helping, now. He needs to figure it out." Gobber shouted. Finn put a small spoonful of the fruit in his mouth and froze, then his eyebrows lifted. He bobbed his head in surprise, then began smashing the dry crackers within the sleeve. Hiccup wasn't sure what exactly he was doing, but soon Finn was running to the dairy table. "This is going to be interesting," he said to Astrid, watching as Eric returned to his station and began slicing open his own dragon fruit. He looked confident with it, which likely meant he'd tried it already. Probably during one of his trips to Jut. "I'm excited to see what they come up with," Astrid said, watching as Finn returned with a stick of butter and 5 small pans. "As long as it's edible," says the woman who has yet to perfect her famous yanog. Hiccup muttered, then flinched when she slapped his leg. "Think positive, Mom," Finn said, his knife sliding through potatoes at a surprisingly slow speed, intentionally making thin slices. This will be the best breakfast you've ever had. And at 5 o'clock, no less. Eric's own knife was cutting through what appeared to be a medley of fruits, but Hiccup couldn't tell from this distance. Go, babe. Adriana's voice cut through the crowd, and Eric smirked, the only sign of distraction. I know, isn't it cute? I made it just for this. Hiccup leaned over to see his daughter standing nearby with Darin on her hip. He wore a blue shirt with the words Daddy's number 1 on the chest. Oh, where you going? Gobber asked. Eric strode toward Adriana and Darin, and lifted a piece of dragon fruit. For my buddy. Darin took it with interest and instantly stuck it in his mouth. And Lady Eric kissed Adriana to a chorus of us before he pulled away and ran back to his table. Hey, no distractions. Finn said, flicking a handful of potato skins away from his pans. Worried, Finn. Eric goaded, tossing his chopped fruits into a bowl and then tossing his walnuts into a hot pan. He added what appeared to be brown sugar and honey before smirking at his brother-in-law. You look nervous. PFT, it will take a little more than fancy fruits to bring me down. Finn said, though he barely blinked for concentration. Less talk, more action. Gobber, Finn might need some help over there. Why don't you give him a hand? Finn grabbed a nearby lemon and threw it at Eric, who dodged with ease. It rolled away and rested against Adriana's boot. She picked it up and handed it to Darin, whose blue eyes widened as he grabbed it in his tiny hands. Addy, why don't you cut it open and give him a slice? Oh gods, I'm not cruel, like some parents. It builds character. Finn flashed her a grin even as he stirred what appeared to be a mix of walnuts and dragon fruit in a bowl. So does dragon fruit, apparently. His grin fell, much to the Burkians' amusement. Hey. Finn slapped Helga's wrist with his spoon as she tried to steal some of his dragon fruit. Get outta here. Helga darted back into the crowd with a grin, licking her fingers. Sizzling filled the air as Eric dropped a handful of potatoes into the pan. Hiccup again wasn't sure what exactly he was doing, but it was starting to smell good in here. Ah, the olay smell of fried potatoes snottled outside a few seats away. Seems kinda ungodly to combine them with fruit. That's because you haven't tasted it yet. Finn said. Are you making pies? Snotlout demanded, standing up. This is breakfast, Haddock. They're not pies. Finn insisted, pouring what appeared to be a fruity batter into each pan. They're dragon fruit tarts. Eric snorted and ran toward the shelf of plates. Wait, plates? He's already plating, Hiccup said. Yes, but potatoes take a long time to cook, even shredded. Astrid said. Also, potatoes and fruit. We had to make it difficult, Genevieve said, her long curls pulled back with a clip. They are both proficient with cooking as it is. If we let them do anything, well, it would be hard to determine a winner. Hiccup nodded, then frowned as Finn returned to his table. All his little pans had disappeared. Hiccup glanced toward the stone ovens nearby and found the door closed, an orange glow emanating from within. Apparently they were baking already. Finn wiped his board of fruit juice, then his hands. Flinging the towel over his shoulder, he watched as Eric tossed his fried potatoes and walnuts, which sizzled loudly. Judging by Finn's pursed lips, it seemed that he too was impressed by the smells of whatever Eric was making. So Eric said, not looking away from his pan. Are you going to just stand there while your pies bake, or make something useful? Finn frowned. Tarts. And what else do I need? Why should I make extra stuff to clutter up my plate? Unlike you, I don't need to get fancy. Right. Hiccup covered his laugh with a hand. Eric's smirk was slowly driving his son insane. Finn drummed his fingers against his counter, momentarily unsure what to do while his pies tarts baked. Then he made a sound like ooh and ran toward the dairy table again. He found a jar labeled heavy cream, then jogged to the dry ingredients table. Burkians turned in their seats and watched as he searched for something until he grabbed a bag of something white that looked too fluffy to be flour, and returned to his table. As Eric began plating his potatoes and walnuts, Finn poured the cream and powder into a bowl and began whisking at a rapid pace. 5 minutes. Gobber shouted. Crap. Finn shouted and whisked even faster, the liquid spraying in all directions. Genevieve, as well as many others, broke into giggles. Even Eric cracked a smile, though he was carefully plating his salad. Finn breathed a sigh of relief when he lifted his whisk, and the whipped cream remained on the spoon. "OOF, that was." "Hey," Bruckliff said. "Is something burning?" "Ah no." Finn grabbed a towel and sprinted to the oven. He lowered the door with muttered prayers before glaring at Cliff. "They're not burning, you troll." "Hey, someone had to remind you about your pies. Tarts. 2 minutes. "Oh gods," Finn muttered, grabbing the tray of hot, bubbly pans and scurrying back to his table. He grabbed plates off the nearby shelf and nearly knocked into Eric, who hissed and retrieved a purple liquid from a cup in the nearby icebox. "Wait," Hiccup pointed. "What is that? When did he make that?" "He made that like 10 minutes ago," Astrid said. "Some sort of dragon fruit slush." "It's a smoothie, Mama," Astrid, Eric said, dropping 5 small glasses onto the table beside each plate. "And you will love it. Stop sucking up to my mother." "Schmooze your own mother, she's on the panel too." "Yes, but my mother taught me how to make smoothies, so." "And now you're insulting my mother's teaching abilities. I ought to take you out." "Count down with me everyone." Gobber interrupted. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Finn hissed through his teeth as he placed a dollop of cream atop each pie, and Eric wiped any stray drips and drops off the plates before throwing the towel over his shoulder. 1. "Time's up." Gobber shouted above the cheers. "Drop your tools. Round 1 is over." Cheers and clapping erupted through the great hall as Eric stepped back, hands raised. Finn exhaled heavily through his mouth as he straightened, observing his work. He looked over at Eric, who raised his brows at Finn's assorted tarts and smirked. Finn crossed his arms and muttered something that sounded an awful lot like fruit salad. Soon Hiccup and the other judges were sitting at the table, and both the boys set a plate before each of them. Surprisingly, both plates looked good, though a bit strange. Finn's tart was topped in what appeared to be a fine layer of potato and chopped walnuts, while purplish fruit bubbled and oozed down the sides of the pan. A dollop of cream had been added to each trifle, but the heat of the dish had caused the cream to melt. Eric had indeed created a sort of fruit salad of dragon fruit, kiwi and strawberries atop a bed of fried potatoes and walnuts, which looked dark with caramelization. And of course there was the small cup of purple liquid beside each of Eric's plates. Gobber had each of them explain their dish to ensure that every ingredient had been included. Each round, the judges would select their favorite dish, and whoever had the most points at the end of the 3 rounds would be declared the winner. And now, I think our esteemed judges are dying for some breakfast. Which should they have first? I think they should start off with a light salad, Eric said. Whet the appetite before finishing off strong, yes. Finn interrupted. I like your thinking. Eric rolled his eyes, but his dimples gave away his amusement. All right, Eric's first then. Astrid said, sliding the plate closer. Lara, Snotlout, Hiccup, and Fishlegs followed suit. Though Hiccup didn't say so, he was sort of nervous. He'd never had dragon fruit before. Finn's reaction earlier had revealed its interesting flavor, but he wasn't sure. It won't bite, Chief. A chorus of laughter echoed through the hall. A black nose shoved its way under Hiccup's arm, sniffing, tongue tasting. Hey! Hiccup shoved Toothless' nose away. You wouldn't like this. On the contrary, Genevieve said. That fatty nearly ate all of the dragon fruit when I arrived. I'm glad I brought extra. Astrid said, lowering her glass of the purple drink. It's weird, but a good weird. I know, dragon fruit is a very subtle flavor. Fishlegs said. But in contrast with the tartness of the strawberries and kiwi, and the slight crunch of the coconut, it all incorporates together quite nicely. Finn rolled his eyes. Gods, you even added coconut. Eric shrugged. I know what goes well together. Including, he leaned toward his mom. Dad's favorite candied walnuts. Lara gave him a slow nod. Indeed. Hey, no schmoozing for extra points. You told me to schmooze my own mother, so here we are. Looks like both of our moms approve. Well, I don't know, Astrid said, folding her hands over her plate. It's good, but the fried potatoes are throwing me off a bit. It's all supposed to go together, right? They're really good individually, but together, I don't know. Not to mention that neither of these really scream breakfast to me, Snotlout said, pounding a fist onto the table. Where's the bacon and eggs? Hiccup swallowed. Not every breakfast has to have bacon and eggs, Snotlout. Though judging by your empty plate, you must have enjoyed it. A few snorts, and then he added, I like the potatoes with it though. It gives it a little salty, Thank you. Eric said, smirking at Finn, who stuck out his tongue. All right, have we all decided on Eric's dish then? Lara asked. When everyone nodded or pushed their plate away, she said, on to Finn's pie, then. Tart. Tart, people. Hiccup plunged his fork into the tart, and blinked in surprise when the crust seemed to bend inwards. I'm no baking expert, Finn, but I don't know about potato as a crust. It seemed like a good idea at the time, Finn said, drumming his fingers against his arm as he glanced at each judge. Luckily you're smart people, you seem to have figured it out. Condescending. I like it. Eric said. More points for me, please. Hey, I was quiet during your turn. Yes, because you're stressed. Look at you, you're sweating and everything. Hiccup held back a snort, even as he took another bite of the tart. It was interesting, to say the least. The dry cracker crust was crumbly, lightly held together with butter and sugar, and the dragon fruit mixture was sweet, but he felt that it needed a little something else to bind the whole thing together more. It needed to be sweeter or needed some sort of spice to give it a little something. The potato crust, even if it was thin and creative, wasn't a hit. He glanced at Astrid, who seemed to be poking through the tart with a mild frown. Gods, this is so stressful. Finn muttered, then clamped his mouth shut as Eric's smile grew. At long last, the judges began to make their notes. When they were finished, Gobber requested each of them to reveal their favorite. Overall, the panel seemed to enjoy Eric's dish more. Surprisingly, Snotlout fought long and hard for Finn's potato pie crust. Finn gave up arguing about the tart, but in the end, Eric was declared the winner for round 1. And now for round 2, which is the dinner category. Gobber exclaimed. Ladies, bring out the second baskets. Hiccup realized that the tables had each been cleaned, likely while the judges were making their decisions. Genevieve and Adriana each dropped off a new basket and then swept back to their seats, giggling all the while. Finn didn't seem particularly disgruntled about his loss of round 1. Instead, he looked ready for round 2 and rolled up the sleeves of his tunic. All right, we're warmed up now. Let's do this thing. Gentleman Gobber said. Open your baskets. Finn and Eric opened the wicker baskets, and the crowd in the great hall quieted so they could hear all the ingredients. They each raised their brows in surprise and began to pull out their items. A pound of pork loin, Gobber said. Ginger, gooseberry reserves, summer squash, and kumquats. Kumquats? Finn asked. Eric lifted one of the little orange fruits with a curious frown. You'll have an hour and a half to make this next dish. Go. Gobber hit the gong, and the second round began. Staring down at the 2 plates before him, Hiccup couldn't decide which of them looked better. Eric's pork loin looked exceptional, steaming with the smell of ginger and brown sugar on the meat and topped with thin slices of roasted kumquats, which turned out to be small, sweet fruits, and a bed of roasted summer squash with spices. Finn, it seemed, was making up for his loss at the breakfast round with gusto. His pork loin was wrapped in bacon, much to Snotlout's joy, with a balsamic and gooseberry reserve glaze. The kumquats and summer squash had been cut into thin slices and joined with a zucchini, which was an odd vegetable that Hiccup had never been fond of. But upon closer inspection, the small salad appeared to be tossed in what Finn called a vinaigrette. As Finn explained his dish, Eric suddenly went still. He frowned and then turned a look over his shoulder back toward his table, and sucked in a small breath. He pursed his lips and faced the table once again. Everything okay over there? Finn asked. Eric merely shook his head. Good. I have to say, Astrid said after all the judges had tried Finn's dish. You've really outdone yourself this time. Finn smirked broadly as Fishlegs launched into praise about the zucchini, squash and kumquat salad, which had been bonded together with a citrusy yet spicy dressing. Hiccup agreed, surprised by his son's ability to put together such warring flavors and yet make them work. Of course, Snotlout praised Finn's bacon-wrapped pork loin with gusto. Next came Eric's dish, which was equally good. The ginger and brown sugar glaze had caramelized and given the meat a great flavor, and the roasted vegetables were also excellent. But halfway through the dish, Hiccup thought something must be missing. As if in confirmation, Eric nodded. Gooseberry preserves. They're over there. Finn's eyes went wide. You forgot them. I forgot them. Well, that's unfortunate. It really is, Fishlegs said morosely. Because the gooseberry preserves would have really pulled all this together. Gobber sighed dramatically. Apparently he was enjoying the drama of this. Unfortunately that means Mr. Larson is eliminated from the round, as the rules state you must include all ingredients. So Finn wins the second round, and overall you are both tied. Seems fitting, Eric said. That dessert should decide our fate. May the best confection win. Finn agreed. They returned to their stations where Genevieve and Adriana had just placed new and final baskets. Genevieve kissed Finn's cheek as she passed and he grinned. All right gentlemen, open your final baskets. Eric and Finn each pulled open their baskets, and the latter cackled. Oh, what have we here? He and Eric each lifted out a glass bottle of amber-colored liquid. Rum. Nice. Eric raised a brow. You want us to make a dessert with rum? People do that all the time. Yeah, but... He sighed and set down the bottle with a clunk. Okay. As you see here, Gobber said, striding up and down the length of the tables. The boys will need to make a dessert using these ingredients: rum, oranges, cinnamon sticks, and chocolate. Hiccup blinked. That's an odd combination. Which will only make it more interesting to see what they come up with. Genevieve whispered, practically giddy with excitement. You will have 1 hour to make your dessert. Your time starts now. Finn wasted no time in marching to the table containing flour, sugar, and dairy products. Eric, however, screwed the top off the rum and poured himself a tiny glass. Hey, no drinking on the job. Finn said, though he grinned as Eric lifted it to his lips. I've never had it before. I have to know what it tastes like. Eric knocked the glass back before grimacing and coughing. Oh gods, that's awful. Vs. Finn laughed. I hate alcohol. Well, you don't have to use it. Then you'll just forfeit and I'll win. Sounds fair to me. Nice try, but no. Eric mused, then made his way over to the baking table. He soon returned with his arms full of flour, sugar, butter, and other items. It was soon apparent that baking required more concentration than cooking, as both young men were soon ignoring all jabs and comments from the crowd as they measured out their various ingredients. Do you know what's interesting? Genevieve said, leaning toward the judges' table. You can be more creative and haphazard with cooking, but baking you have to be so precise with your ingredients or it won't turn out. Indeed, Fishlegs nodded emphatically. It will be a miracle if both cakes come out moist and perfect, not underdone or too dry. Hiccup nodded in agreement, watching as Eric poured his chocolate into a glass bowl, and then set that bowl atop a pot of boiling water. He'd hung the pot of water over the nearest fire pit a few minutes ago, and he'd wondered what Eric would need boiling water for. Soon enough Eric was whisking inside the bowl, and he realized the chocolate must be melting. That's smart, he commented. He remembers all of Olaf's tricks, Lara said. The hard part is not burning it though. Finn was adding orange zest to his bowl of what appeared to be cake batter. He unscrewed the lid on the rum before adding a splash. He began to screw the lid back on before pausing, shrugging and then taking a healthy swig. Hey, you said no drinking on the job. Eric said from his own table. Finn replaced the lid, utterly nonplussed. Hey, you got to have some. Why can't I? He took up a wooden spoon and began mixing his batter so that the rum and orange zest soon disappeared. Eric brought his glass bowl of melted chocolate to his own bowl of batter and added it to a chorus of oohs and ahs. He grinned and scraped the bowl clean before setting it aside. He cut open one of his oranges and squeezed the juice into the batter, much to Hiccup's dismay. Chocolate and orange. I don't know how to feel about this. Keep an open mind, it might be good. Astrid said. Now, Eric said, not looking up as he added a splash of rum to his batter as well. You mean it will be good? Right. Hiccup said tensely. Neither of them has used their cinnamon sticks yet. Genevieve said. Eric made a hum of assent, as if chastising himself for forgetting another ingredient, and grabbed one of the sticks. He began grating it with a strange metallic item with metal ridges, and it seemed the cinnamon was being ground into a fine dust so that it fell into the batter. Right. Finn said, grabbing a pot and setting it over the flames to heat. He moved toward the drink table and grabbed a jar murky brown liquid. This he poured into the pot and then threw a handful of sliced oranges, cinnamon sticks and what looked like a few small brown balls. Do I even want to know? Hiccup asked weakly. Cloves, Hiccup. Oh. What are cloves? He's making cider. Who picked you as a judge anyway? I'm sure I don't know, Astrid, I've been asking myself this for 2 hours. You're the chief. Cliff piped up a row behind them. You always get to be the judge. Great. I won't poison you, Dad. Finn said before tasting his batter with a spoon. Perfect. Hey. Genevieve had darted forward to dip her finger in the batter before scurrying back to her seat. She sucked the batter off her finger and hummed. That's really good. Finn poured his batter into a pan and was soon sliding it into the stone oven nearby. Moments later Eric slid his own cake pan into the oven, the chocolate batter gleaming in the firelight before the door closed. Now what? Hiccup asked no one in particular as Eric began melting more chocolate in the glass bowl, and Finn stirred his cider. He gave it a taste and nodded in satisfaction before returning to his station. Eric dropped a stick of butter and some sugar into the glass bowl and began mixing the softening chocolate together. Once they were all melted and mixed together, he added a splash of rum, though he frowned as he did so. Finn, on the other hand, had cracked 4 eggs into a bowl and was whisking them with sugar until a grainy yellow mixture appeared. To Hiccup's surprise, he was soon fitting the bowl over a pot of boiling water just as Eric had done, and began mixing without stopping. How does he know how to do that? And why? Hiccup asked. Perhaps he's learned from watching Eric, Lara suggested. Or even read some of Olaf's old cookbooks. He had tons of them, you know. As for why, I don't know. I was never much of a baker. Hiccup didn't know, but he was again surprised by both boys' knowledge of baking. He'd clearly underestimated them. Eric had pulled the chocolate sauce off the heat and set it aside. It was now dark and glossy. When Eric tried it, Hiccup expected him to frown with distaste, but Eric shrugged and seemed to think, not half bad. Finn was practically sweating as he continued whisking his egg and sugar mixture. He glanced over at the oven, likely planning to check on the cake soon, but he clearly couldn't stop whatever he was doing. As soon as Hiccup thought this though, Finn pulled the bowl off the heat and set it on the counter. He dropped the whisk and grabbed 3 sticks of butter from his table. He added one and began whisking again. As soon as it disappeared into the fluffy white mixture, he added another, and again until each had disappeared. It's frosting. Fish Legs said suddenly, and Hiccup realized he was right. Right before their very eyes, Finn had made frosting. Not yet, Finn muttered. He grabbed the hot bowl with a towel and rushed to the icebox before setting it inside to cool. Judging by his mistake on the breakfast round, he didn't want this frosting to melt. It was some time of watching Eric and Finn check their frosting, or glaze in Eric's case, and keep an eye on their cakes to make sure they wouldn't burn. At Gobber's 20-minute warning, Eric stuck a knife into his knife to see it was finished baking. The knife came out clean, and with a nod of satisfaction he pulled it out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool. It was only a few minutes before Finn followed suit. For a moment, they both stood there staring at their hot cakes. Hiccup wondered how long they'd have to wait before removing them from the pans, when Eric took up his knife again. Okay, he sighed heavily before running his knife along the inner edges of the pan, careful not to cut the cake. Even Finn paused to watch as he carefully flipped the pan over and gingerly lifted it off the cake. There was a collective intake of breath as the cake stuck to the pan ever so slightly, but with a little prodding it finally released. It was a little scarred, but it was as beautiful a cake as Hiccup had ever seen. With a sigh of relief, Eric dropped the pan to a chorus of cheers. He waved them off, but Hiccup could tell he was relieved. Finn looked slightly unnerved at this but shook it off quickly. He checked his frosting in the icebox and seemed to be satisfied, but left it inside to keep cool. It was warm in the Great Hall and he likely didn't want to take any chances. The removal of Finn's cake from the pan wasn't much different from Eric's. It took a little more patience, which was difficult for Finn, but he endured. His cake was a nice golden orange to Eric's dark chocolate brown. The room was beginning to smell divine. Tough Nut smacked his lips nearby, much to Astrid's disgust. Excited chatter rose throughout the Great Hall as Finn waited for his cake to cool. He watched with everyone else as Eric did not wait, and instead poured his chocolate glaze over the steaming cake without preamble. Hiccup wondered just how that glaze was going to stay on the cake without melting, but he supposed he'd find out soon enough. Finn's fingers tapped against his arm impatiently as he waited for his own cake to cool. He poured 5 cups of the aromatic cider and set them aside. Eventually he struck up a conversation with Genevieve to pass the time, but when Gobber finally gave the 10-minute warning, he set a hand atop the cake. "It'll have to do," he muttered before retrieving his frosting from the icebox. Snotlout sighed with annoyance and began whining about how long this was taking. Eric grabbed a handful of plates as Finn poured a massive helping of frosting onto his cake and began spreading it with a long flat knife. People began chattering excitedly once more as time passed. Soon Finn grabbed a stick of cinnamon and began shaving it over the frosted cake, just as Eric had done previously. Finn stepped back and observed his cake, likely searching for flaws. At long last, he nodded and turned to Eric, who stood by with crossed arms. "You about done?" Finn ignored the giggles echoing around the room. "I serve nothing but perfection, Larson." "That's what you said about the potato crust." Gobber stepped forward before they could continue bickering. "All right, that's the time." The Great Hall erupted with claps and cheers. Eric and Finn brought their cakes over to the judges' table while Genevieve and Adriana brought forks and plates and Finn's cider. It was quickly decided that they should try Eric's cake first so Finn's cider didn't overwhelm the judges' taste buds and ruin the experience. Or so Eric said. Hiccup was wary to try Eric's cake, but his unease was soon put to rest. The glaze had seeped into the hot cake, keeping it moist. And to his endless surprise, the orange and rum flavors were both subtle and yet obviously there. He had to admit it, the cake was fantastic. Finn's cake was equally flavorful, what with the cinnamon and orange flavors, and the cider tied it all together. His cake was a little dry compared to Eric's, but it was by no means hard to swallow. Finn grinned and crossed his arms proudly, so sure of his victory. But, Hiccup reflected, there was one small flaw. "Well, what do we think, judges?" "Both cakes are delicious," Fishlegs said. "Eric's is good, but it is a little rich for me," Astrid said. "I think flavor-wise, I enjoy Finn's more. But there is that one small detail," Hiccup said. "Detail?" Finn asked. "What small detail?" Eric glanced between their cakes and then choked on a laugh. He quickly tried to smother it but he couldn't hide the dimples. "What are you laughing at?" Finn demanded. Covering his face with a hand, Eric said, "You don't see it. The one thing you, missed." "Missed? I didn't miss anything," Babe Genevieve said gently. "What's the primary difference between yours and Eric's cakes?" Finn frowned and looked between them. "I don't." "Slow, isn't he?" Snotlout asked dryly. Suddenly, Finn gasped in horror. "I forgot the chocolate." The table of judges and many of the onlookers erupted into laughs, especially as Finn collapsed on the spot. His face was flushed with horror and embarrassment. For his part, Eric tried to stop the laughter, but he couldn't quite manage it. "Well hey, if we're being completely honest, your cake does look really good," Gobber Finn said from behind his arm. "Just announce my defeat and let my shame consume me." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Genevieve said through her own laughter, grabbing his free arm and trying to pull him off the floor. "People of Berk," Gobber announced. "We have our winner, Eric Larson." Cheers erupted through the hall, though they clapped even louder when Finn peeled himself up off the floor at last. He looked thoroughly embarrassed, but he didn't argue that Eric had won fair and square. The brothers embraced and clapped each other on the back. But as they pulled away, Finn stuck a finger in his chest. "Next year, we're doing a rematch. You're on." Eric grinned. "If it makes you feel any better," Adriana said, taking Eric's hand. "It looks like Darren likes Uncle Finn's cake better." Sure enough, they turned to see Darren sitting in Hiccup's lap. His meaty fists had taken 2 large handfuls of cake and was cramming them into his mouth. The sight was adorable, but Finn stepped in and pulled the cake away. "You're a little young for booze cake, my man." "Oh, good point." Adriana winced. "Kinda forgot that detail." Darren slapped his hands onto the table and whined, clearly miffed at the treat being taken away. Hiccup winced as flakes of frosting sprayed into his face with each slap. Finn retreated to his station and spooned some leftover frosting into a bowl. He placed it in front of Darren with a smile. "There you go, kiddo." Darren stuck a hand into it with gusto. Babe, this cake is really good though," Genevieve said, sucking on her spoon. "I'm not sure chocolate would have done it justice." "Yeah, probably not." Adriana tried a healthy bite of Eric's cake and nodded. "This one is also really good oh." She frowned and swallowed. "Oh, maybe not. I hate rum." Eric chuckled. "I didn't think you'd like it. We prefer our cake unspiked." "More for me," Finn said, trying Eric's cake. "It is good though, bruh. You'll have to show me how you made it." Genevieve nodded emphatically, clearly enjoying the moistness of the chocolate cake. A slapping sound preceded Hiccup's pronounced, "Gah." Genevieve nearly spat out her cake. Darren had turned to face Hiccup and slapped him in the face with a large handful of frosting. A handprint was on his cheek and nose, and a dollop of frosting was sliding down his neck. Hiccup frowned down at his grandson, who returned to his bowl of frosting without preamble. "Thanks, buddy." Toothless' nose reappeared in seconds and he began licking the frosting off of Hiccup's face and neck. Toothless. "Stop." Aristrid. Some things never changed, it seemed. Chapter 8, Rite of Passage. Chapter text. It was an exciting day at the Larson household. One that would be remembered for the rest of Adriana and Eric's lives. One that they'd both longed for and dreaded with every ounce of their combined being. Darren's first birthday. Adriana didn't know how to feel about this. One part of her was so proud of him and how much he'd grown. No longer was he the tiny snuggly baby that she'd held for long hours of the night and carried to and fro. While he still required much carrying and snuggling, Darren was now on the verge of becoming a toddler. He'd walked his first steps a few weeks prior and he'd begun exploring the house with so much enthusiasm that she and Eric could hardly keep up. It was wonderful and amazing and utterly beautiful. But the other part of her wouldn't stop bursting into tears at random intervals. Eric gave her a consoling hug but it was no use. Darren was growing up and before she could do anything about it, Darren would be leaving the house to fulfill his own adventures and she'd be an old hag. Her husband choked on a laugh when she said as much. "Annie, he's turning 1, not 17. I can no, I just see can't he handle it." Adriana blubbered into his shirt. "I'm not ready for the baby stage to be over." "Well, I guess we'd better have more babies then." Adriana pulled back with a loud sniff and poked him sharply in the chest. "It's not funny." "I know." Eric raised his palms, but was obviously fighting a smile. "I'm just saying." "Yeah, I'm just saying too." Adriana rubbed her face. "Some supportive husband you are, you just want to go upstairs and..." A gentle tap of footsteps sounded as Darren toddled into the room. His blonde hair shone in the morning light. His blue eyes were focused on a red rubber ball clutched in his hands, not paying attention as he nearly walked headfirst into a cabinet. Whoa there! Eric wedged his hand beneath the wood and his son's face, protecting it just in time. "Watch where you're going, kiddo." Darren looked up in surprise and then held up the ball. "Throw it." Eric squatted down and held out his hands. "Throw it to Daddy." Instead of throwing the ball, Darren walked into Eric's open arms and gave him a hug. Adriana promptly burst into tears again. "Annie. How much longer do we have until he understands what you actually said and he won't just give us hugs anymore? Annie. Eric stood up and set his hands on her face. Are you feeling okay? Adriana sniffed, blinking at him through swollen eyes. What? Are you feeling okay? Because if you're not, we can call off the party. Call off my son's first birthday party. Adriana demanded, voice thick with emotion. Why would you ever suggest? Because you've been crying for an hour. Eric said, slightly exasperated. Look, I know it's hard to watch him grow up, but he's not leaving us yet. The kid can't survive without us, I mean look at him. She faced Darren in time to see him throw the ball, which bounced down the hall. He ran after it with a squeal, bumped into a side table and collapsed. He was up in seconds, as if he hadn't noticed anything at all, and disappeared around a corner. He still needs us and he'll still need us for a long, long time. Eric said firmly. Don't fret the time away. Not fretting. Adriana muttered, wiping her face. Then what is it? I don't know. Well, it's got to be something. I don't know, Eric, sometimes a woman just needs to cry, okay? Okay. You had 2 sisters, you should know this. Yeah, but sisters are different. A girl is a girl, there's no difference. The relationship is different, Eric said, still slightly exasperated. I never asked either of my sisters if they wanted a hug or to talk things out while they were. He stuttered into silence, pursing his lips. Adriana squinted. While they were what? Nothing. Nothing. Eric said, turning down the hall. Where'd Darren go? Adriana grabbed his arm and wheeled him around. While they were what, Eric? A blush rose up his collar. While they were indisposed. She blinked. Indisposed. Eric exhaled deeply through his nose, the blush spreading. While they were on their period. Adriana blinked again. Oh. Right. Then she snorted. Is that what you think this is? For the record, I'm not on mine. Well. Eric spluttered. Gah, women. Darren, where'd you go? Despite herself, Adriana couldn't help but laugh as he marched down the hall in search of their son. She reflected on the last hour and realized that it would make sense, how her emotional wreckage might seem to him that she wasn't feeling well. But that was one misconception. Sometimes the emotions would not be swayed, and there was no rhyme or reason for it. Babe, Adriana said, striding after him. She found Eric trying to pull Darren out of a closet, from which was strewn a basket of old toys that they'd hidden from him. Unfortunately he had so many that they had to put some away to create space. She crossed her arms and leaned against the door frame. You're sweet for trying, you know. Yeah, well, hey, give me that. No, I'm sorry buddy, but you can't have sharp objects. Eric firmly prized a quiver of arrows from Darren's meaty fingers. Sometimes it's just hard to tell, I guess. If you're just having an emotional day or if there's other things going on. Adriana snorted. Well, you can always ask me. I'd prefer not to. Well, all the same, if it's easier to just ask, you can. Adriana frowned. What's that doing in there anyway? I just threw it in here a while back. We need more hangers. Eric said, still trying to remove Darren's hands from the leather strap. He seemed to be fighting a smile. Or a shed. Or a barn. Eric bobbed his head. Or a shed. Hey, listen buddy, you're too young for arrows. As the quiver was finally taken away, Darren threw himself to the ground and began to wail with anguish. Though his face turned red and he wailed up at Adriana, there were no tears. Eric rubbed the back of his neck and flicked his eyes up at her. You were saying about him growing up too fast. Adriana breathed a laugh. Yeah. Come on, buddy, up you get. Let's make lunch and then we'll have a nap before your party. Darren didn't seem to find this an acceptable response to his woes and screamed louder. Adriana and Darren were in much better spirits by the time family and friends began to arrive. Eric had begun to wonder if today was the best day for a party, after nearly an hour of Adriana's tears and another hour of Darren's own tantrums. But after their son finally went down for a nap and they began decorating the house with blue streamers and balloons, Adriana's spirits rose to new heights. She'd even found time to do her hair, which she'd braided into a coronet around her head. The golden locks had been swept away from her face and braided back, every hair tucked into place with a pin. When she'd come downstairs wearing a periwinkle blue dress with her hair up like that, his stomach had done a wild flop. Even now he needed to remind himself to keep his eyeballs in their sockets, with so many friends and family over. Still, with her hair up like that, it was doing wonders for her neckline, and the dress was hugging her curves just right. Gods, she'd drive him mad one day. Thank you. And the best part, Adriana said, shoving her hands into folds at her hips. It has pockets. No. Genevieve said in a hushed voice. Yes. It was Morgan's idea. Well, I'll have to ask her to show me how she does it. That's something I must take home to Jet. It's so practical. How did we never think of this before? Because we're women, obviously. Inga said in a low drawl. What sort of women need pockets to carry around day-to-day necessities? As if women don't need to carry around certain daily necessities when the certain time of month comes around. Adriana and Genevieve nodded emphatically. Eric walked to the drink table, hoping they didn't notice he'd been eavesdropping. That was twice now in the same day. Bruh. Cliff emerged, a glass of lemonade in his hand. Where've you been? Here, Eric said, pouring himself a glass and taking a sip. A better question is, where is Darren? What, you can't see him from his perch? Eric turned with raised brows, and then snorted. Darren was indeed perched high up on Finn's shoulders, his little hands grabbing at his uncle's red locks. Finn had his hands firmly around his nephew's legs, in case he should get any ideas about discovering gravity the hard way. One already, eh? Cliff said, wiping a fake tear. They grow up so fast. Not you too. Eric warned, poking him in the chest. I already had to take care of Adriana once today. You don't say? Cliff asked, slurping his lemonade loud enough to draw several people's attention. Well, we are getting up in age. I'm literally 19 years old, Cliff. Yeah, bruh. You're so old. You're 18. Yup. I'm still a young, spry teenager. You're an old man. Eric gave him a flat look and then turned back to face the crowd of people all clustered in his house. Of course Hiccup and Astrid were present, as well as his own mother, Lara, Magnus and her husband, Gregory and their kids, Finn and Genevieve, as well as Inga, Helga and Tarin. Overall it was difficult choosing who to invite because there were so many people, but Adriana wanted the party to be here with their closest friends and family. So they'd had to be choosy. The only downside is the dragons weren't invited, and it was only proving a problem because they kept blocking the light of the sun by pressing their noses against the glass of each window. Toothless, Stormfly, Lily, Charger, Zap, Max, and all the Shockjaw pups were each taking turns fighting over the windows. Hiccup had already gone outside on more than one occasion to break up a few squabbles. Eric prayed to all the gods that their new house wouldn't be torched, and on his son's birthday, no less. After a particularly sharp yank on his hair, Finn winced and pulled Darren off his shoulders. You're a little tyrant, you know that. He dug his fingers into Darren's belly and he squirmed and squealed. All right, get out of here. Darren's feet hit the ground and he swayed slightly. Finn held out a hand in case he needed to catch him, but Darren caught his balance and toddled forward. Catching sight of Eric, he grinned and plodded forward until his arms wrapped around Eric's prosthetic leg. Hey buddy. Oh. Cliff said, setting down his drink. I totally forgot. Here, little man. Darren seemed fascinated momentarily by Cliff's thick curly hair, just as he usually was by Genevieve's, as Cliff withdrew a colored cone hat with a rubber band. Darren pulled at the thin rubber string in confusion as Cliff set the hat on his head. There you go. Birthday boy mode, activated. Eric snorted. What does that even mean? I don't know, but he's adorable. Indeed, Darren looked a bit confused at the chorus of oaths as he turned. The cone hat atop his head had a tuft of multicolored streamers at the top, which clashed brightly with his blonde hair. He grinned and waved at the crowd, and was promptly knocked to the floor by a bright blue ball of scales and shimmering wings. A gasp rose up from the guests as Eric lunged forward. The small blue dragon leapt through the legs of many guests as he pulled Darin to his feet. He didn't cry, thankfully, but he did look confused. "Pepper!" Finn shouted, chasing after the baby Shockjaw. Genevieve joined the fray, even as the sound of tables and chairs screeched across the floors. Adriana was at his side in seconds, surveying Darin's condition. "Oh baby, are you okay?" "Yeah, he's okay," Eric said in surprise. "I think he's just in shock." "I know the feeling," Cliff said, unsurprised by this turn of events and watching in amusement as Finn and Genevieve chased the Shockjaw through the house. "Sometimes everything just collapses around you and you're just confused as to what happened and if it was your fault or not." "Well yeah, you're a klutz," Adriana said. Darin squealed in surprise when Pepper leaped onto her stomach and dodged away, clearly pleased with the chase. Cups were upended and people yelped in surprise as her wings began to shimmer. Eric picked up Darin and followed Adriana to a safer corner just as Pepper began to run down the hall. Finn dove out of the crowd and pinned her down. The sound of muffled sparks and growls emitted from beneath him before he struggled to his knees, his arms wrapped firmly around the squirming Shockjaw. "You are a bad girl," Finn panted. Eric briefly wondered how he wasn't flinching at the electricity coursing around his chest and arms, but then realized Finn was wearing one of his leather flight suits, reinforced with rubber. Pepper growled indignantly. Her tail came up and nearly slapped Finn in the face before a firm hand caught her by the nose, and she came face to face with Hiccup. "No." Hiccup's command was firm. Pepper stilled and her eyes widened. With her paws drooped and her tail curling upward in a protective manner, she looked quite adorable. But Eric would not be swayed. The little pup needed to go back outside, no matter how cute she was. Hiccup's expression brooked no argument. "Now you go outside and be good." Without another word, Finn marched to the door and dropped her outside. She flapped her wings and landed on her feet, but turned a disdainful look up at him. "Stay outside, Pepper." A sharp growl sounded and she cowered to the ground as Zap and Max turned the corner. Finn closed the door before they could see any more, but he turned an apologetic look on Eric and Adriana. "Sorry." "It's all right," Adriana said, helping Helga mop up a few overturned glasses. "They're each a bundle of energy. It's part of raising babies. Trust me, I know." A chorus of giggles sounded from the guests and soon enough, conversation resumed. "You all right, little man?" Finn asked Darin, approaching with a concerned look. "Yeah, he's good," Eric said. "He hardly even blinked. Of course he's fine, handling dragons and surprises is in his blood," Hiccup said, holding out his hands. Darin was quickly transferred to his arms, and he pointed at something across the room. "Want to have a balloon?" They watched as Hiccup took Darin across the room, and Finn sighed heavily. "I tell you what though, those babies are driving me crazy. Pepper especially. She's always getting into stuff." "Well yeah, I'd expect nothing less from a dragon named Pepper," Cliff said, snorting into his lemonade. "She couldn't have gotten into the salt jar." "Little tyrant," Finn muttered, straightening his jacket. "Didn't stop sneezing for days." "They'll grow out of it eventually," Adriana said. "Yeah, eventually. They're getting bigger by the day and their energy is only increasing." Finn sighed. "I can only do so much in a day." Genevieve squeezed his arm. "I think someone else needs to take over training them. But they like me best." "Well, like you said, you can't do everything." A look of pensive worry had stolen over Finn's face. He seemed to momentarily forget where he was, lost in a mental list of all the things he likely had to do after the party. Eric couldn't imagine. He himself was fairly busy and yet he wasn't captain of the guard, training a brood of Shockjaw pups, traveling every few days to see his girlfriend, and being groomed to take the mantle as chief. The worry on Finn's face disappeared in a blink and he smiled down at Genevieve. She gave him a sympathetic smile. Try though he might, Finn couldn't hide his emotions from those that knew him best. Eric debated asking his brother-in-law if there was anything he could do when Hiccup and Darin returned. Darin twisted in his grandfather's arms and blinked at Finn. He lifted a hand as if to wave and said, "Win." Eric's heart stuttered in his chest. Finn shrugged. "Ah shucks kids, I know I'm a winner." "No," Genevieve said in a hoarse whisper. "I think. Finn, I think he's trying to say your name." "What?" Cliff erupted. "Uncle Cliff. You're supposed to say Uncle Cliff first." "Excuse me," Adriana said with a small pout. "What are me and Eric?" "Chopped liver." Finn was staring at his nephew with a look of shock. Are you sure that's what he said?" Darren Hiccup said, drawing the small boy's attention and pointing. "Who is that?" Darren blinked wide blue eyes at Finn and said nothing. He leaned forward with his arms outstretched, clearly wanting to be transferred. Finn took him a victorious smile. Eric snorted, remembering how terrified Finn had been at the prospect of a baby joining the family. He wondered if Finn knew how natural he looked with a baby in his arms. He didn't miss Genevieve's knowing smile. "I don't know guys," Finn said, peering down at Darren as he fiddled with a rubber strap on Finn's shoulder. "I don't think he said it." "I'm surprised," Hiccup said. "I would have thought you'd be cheering with victory, Finn." "I don't want to be disappointed." Darren looked up at him and grabbed at Finn's nose. "Win." Finn's blue eyes widened. "Oh gods," Adriana sighed. "Darren, say mama." Darren looked at her for a moment before saying, "Win again." Finn's face split into a grin. "Ah yes." "Oh no," Eric sighed. "I win." Finn cheered, raising Darren high over his head. Several people glanced at them in confusion. "Win." "Yes. That's me." Finn cackled and spun Darren in a circle. "Who's the dream team?" "You and me, that's who." Genevieve snorted. "The dream team?" "Yup. You only wish you were as awesome as me and Darren." "He learned to say my name before anyone else's." "That means I'm his favorite." Adriana looked quite put out. "Yeah, well, he's going to bless you with vomit next if you don't stop spinning him," Eric said in a flat tone. Finn instantly ceased, but he was still grinning. "What's my name?" "Darren, hey." "What's my name?" I don't think he understands. "Win." "Oh, I could die of happiness right here." Cliff gave her a derisive sniff and walked away. "I must admit I have lost my appetite." "Oh, don't be such a baby." Eric chuckled as he disappeared into the crowd. Adriana slid an arm around his waist, smiling despite herself. "Ah well, I guess we'll let Uncle Win have this one." To her credit, Finn beamed. Even as a slush-filled spring finally gave way to summer's warmth, the breeze of the ocean smelling of salt and brine and wishes, Finn couldn't believe what he was doing. Jet was as beautiful as ever, a shimmering star on the map of their world. He couldn't help but bask in the glow of that beautiful speck of land every time he and Zap arrived. Sunlight glittering across the turquoise lagoon and sparkled across the mist of the distant waterfall. A rainbow arched across the mist. It was exceptionally beautiful. Just as beautiful as the sight of the men, women and children riding dragons across the land far below. Pride didn't feel like a strong enough word for what he felt in that moment. After nearly 2 years since training the Jatans, the humble village was finally out of its shell. There had been many arguments, or healthy debates as Kiev liked to call them, and even blood, sweat and tears, but they'd finally made it. Jut had slowly begun to change over time. So slowly that he hadn't quite noticed. Somehow, 2 years later, it was a different island completely. A safe haven for the West, a training ground for another generation of dragon riders, another ally, another team of friends and family. A second home. If he wasn't meant to be chief of Burke when his father retired, Finn might consider moving here. Living here. Marrying Genevieve and starting a family here. His stomach twisted in his gut in a way that had nothing to do with Zap's swerve around a tall building. He could still do those last things, hoped and prayed for it actually. But he belonged with Burke. They needed him more than Jut, which had Ivan and Thuggery and so many others. Finn had taught them everything he knew and more. They had even taught him new ways to fight, new ways to think and outsmart an opponent. Hell, all the Sullivan boys had taught him things he'd never known. New ways to hunt and fish and cook and wrestle. A band of brothers. A second family. Gods, all this introspection was enough to make him throw up. But in a good way. Zap must have sensed his rising anxiety because she looked up at him over her broad shoulder and crooned. Finn exhaled a shaky breath. I'm all right, Zappy. Just nervous. Gods, what was he doing? They landed outside the Sullivans' home. As soon as Finn's boots hit the ground and he hauled a bag off her saddle, Zap tore off down the street in search of her mate and pups. Now that the pups were older, they were finally old enough to make their own trips to see their father, though Finn suspected they did their own traveling. It made him worry somehow. Max and Zap didn't seem bothered. They were dragons after all. The pups were a year and a half old. They had to leave the nest eventually, and at nearly half Zap's size, they had nearly reached maturity. Pepper was still as mischievous as ever, all glittering turquoise scales and savage grins. Thunder was stoic like his father, his navy blue scales dusted with flecks of light blue. He liked to fly among storm clouds and play in the rain. As infants, while the other babies had fled in terror at the sound of thunder, he had leapt into the skies as if to challenge the gods themselves. Finn should have known from the very first day that the pup who'd zapped him in the hand would be fearless. The other female was a beautiful, nearly white shade of blue with big dark eyes. Genevieve had fallen in love with her almost instantly and named her Belle. She was docile and loving, but didn't back down from a fight when her brothers got on her nerves. Naming the other two boys had been difficult as they were both outright rambunctious and liked to chew things. Eventually Cliff had firmly said, just name them Chewy and Snack, and somehow it had stuck. Genevieve had laughed herself hoarse and Finn had hated the names at first, but, well, they were accurate. Chewy had literally chewed through almost every good pair of shoes the Haddocks owned, which was a real pain for Hiccup as he really only needed one boot, and to buy just one was a hassle for the seller. And Snack, well, there was simply no shortage of snacks for him. Both teal-green colored boys were tall like their father, but Snack, well, he was a bit chunkier because always seemed to be eating something. Chewy at least seemed to just chew on things, perhaps to sharpen his teeth or something. Finn wasn't sure. Regardless, these 5 pups were a lot of work, and more often than not he collapsed into bed without bothering to take his own boots off. He was glad Zap would be keeping them occupied while he and Genevieve. You've arrived? Finn faced Kiev, who'd just appeared from the barn. Yeah, just got here. They shook hands and Kiev gave him a knowing grin. Are you ready? Though his stomach gave a nearly painful flop, Finn nodded. Yeah, I think so. Good, good. Kiev smiled, and then slapped his shoulder. His expression was nothing short of proud and excited. He glanced up and down the street. Everything is being prepared in the town hall. You both take your time, but not too much time. Right. Finn nodded, hoping that he wouldn't say anything too uncomfortable. If all went well there would likely be no shortage of kisses, but he didn't wish to discuss these things with Kiev. Well, I mean, I merely told Amon that 6 would be a good time to begin. That's all. Ah. Finn nodded. Amon was the local cookmaster of Jut, and he preferred to serve his food piping hot. Finn would need to make sure they didn't take too much time, or Amon would come after him with a wooden spoon. Then again, Kiev said with a smirk beneath his graying beard. It's not every day one proposes. Enjoy it. Finn hissed through his teeth, glancing up and down the street. Kiev, what if she's nearby? She's not. She's in the lower town assisting with a few things, so she'll be occupied for a while yet. Kiev chortled at the relief no doubt showing on Finn's face. In the meantime, the loft is yours as always. Finn nodded, his stomach knotting. Cool. Thanks. Kiev seemed to understand he was feeling less cheery and more anxious than usual. With a gentle pat on his arm, he said, Good luck. I'll see you in a few hours. Finn watched him stride back into the barn. He forced himself to take a slow, deep breath. It didn't seem to help. In fact, he felt like he was about to throw up on Molly's begonias. He strode into the house and found the matron of the Sullivan family in the kitchen, drying her hands. Ah, Finn. Molly rushed over and gave him a quick hug. How was the flight? Good. She must have seen his nerves or read the discomfort in his eyes because Molly squinted. I think. Tea would be good. She nodded. Something for the nerves. Why don't you drop off your bag and I'll bring you up a cup? Finn nodded. Thanks, Molly. She rested a hand on his arm as he passed. You'll be just fine. Another hour and you'll be happier than you've ever been. The words brought a smile to his face. Gods, he hoped so. He nodded and marched up the stairs. Genevieve was expecting him around the dinner hour, but she did not realize he was here already. No doubt she'd found things to do to occupy her time as she always did. So he had time to get ready, to at least look like he was about to propose. Here she was, probably thinking they were just going to have a nice dinner date with nothing particularly special. Well, it was a date. But a date like no other. A date he hoped she would never forget. Swallowing his nerves, Finn breezed into the loft and began unpacking his bags. He'd taken the weekend off so he could spend the weekend with Genevieve. Regardless of their date, he was looking forward to a 3-day weekend in which he didn't have to work at all. He'd been working almost non-stop for months and frankly, he wanted a break. A break in which he could spend time with his girlfriend, hopefully his fiancée, if the next hour went well, and relax and not have to worry about anything. Well, almost. He was certainly worried now. Exhaling heavily through his mouth, Finn shook off the nerves. Stop. It's going to be fine. You got this. His stomach clenched in knots again and he huffed. Fearless Finn indeed. As much as he didn't enjoy tea, he hoped Molly would arrive with it soon. He'd drink as much leaf water as she wanted if it would just soothe his nerves. The last thing he wanted was to throw up on Genevieve while trying to propose. Almost 2 years, and this is what it had all culminated to. Finn pulled out the small black box in his bag and opened it, peering down at the sparkling gold ring. It was perfect for Genevieve, the girl he loved more than life itself. She would say yes. She had to say yes. If she didn't. Oh gods, what if she didn't? He snapped the box shut in his fingers with a loud snap. He needed to get a serious grip. The sound of Molly's light footsteps on the stairs pulled him out of his own thoughts, and he set the box down on the dresser. Everything would be fine. She'd say yes. He was just nervous. And excited. But mostly nervous. If Eric and Cliff had done it and survived, he could do this. He could do this. Molly halted on the threshold with a steaming mug in her hands. She took one look at Finn's expression and chuckled. Oh Finn, here. Drink this, it will help. Goodness, I don't think I've ever seen you so nervous. Give me a monstrous nightmare to wrangle any day, Finn said hoarsely, hating how his fingers shook as he took the mug. It's fine. I know it's going to be fine. It's just scary, I guess. Molly nodded. Do you know my Kiev nearly wept with relief when I said yes. We were lucky to be a love match, but we were young and he was untried. He had many expectations to uphold as a new chieftain. He was prompted to ask for my hand not long after, and I dare say he was terrified. Finn huffed a laugh and took a sip of his tea. Peppermint and ginger. I find that surprising. Kiev seems confident in everything he does. He is, but he's an emotional man. More emotional than me. In fact, he wept with happiness after you asked for Genevieve's hand. Molly chuckled. And my Genevieve, she has her father's kindness and gentleness. She loves you. She will say yes, Finn. Don't you worry. Between her kind words and the tea, Finn did feel better. Her words soothed his nerves and the tea soothed his stomach. He nodded. Thanks. You know you've always been like a second mom to me. I want you to know how much I appreciate it. Molly's eyes went bright and she tsked her tongue before wrapping her arms around him. And you've been like another son. In more ways than one. Thank you. Finn pulled away and nodded. He felt more grounded. Calmer. He wasn't sure if it was the tea or Molly, but he felt ready. Molly nodded with finality. Your color's back. Get yourself handsome, well, more handsome, less rugged, Finn laughed. And I will see you at the town hall. Finn nodded as she pulled the door closed. He drank the rest of his tea and set the empty mug on the dresser beside the ring box. Okay. Go time. Half an hour later, Finn stepped into the barn in the lower town and smiled at the sight of his favorite girl standing at a table, her back to him as she put various items in a basket. Multiple baskets filled the table around Genevieve as she worked. For a few moments he leaned against the door and just watched her. She chewed her lip when she worked like this, deep in thought as she took great care in organizing each basket. With the setting sun outside, the barn had grown dimmer in the corners, casting more shadows throughout the room. She'd lit a few candles on the table. The flames guttered as she reached for another basket. The yellow light seemed to set her curls aflame even as the shadows darkened her eyes more than they already were. Soundlessly, Finn crept closer and poked her left shoulder, ducking to her right when she turned. When she frowned and looked to her right, he was already there capturing her mouth with his. Genevieve gasped ever so slightly before realizing there was only one man in the archipelago that would do something so silly to get her attention. "Well, hi there," Genevieve breathed when he pulled away, grinning. "Hey." Finn lifted her off the ground in a hug and she squealed in surprise, her feet dangling half a foot from the ground. He kissed her neck and nuzzled her ear lovingly. They could stay like this forever, her arms around his neck. "You're squeezing me." Genevieve pinched his shoulders. He laughed and let her slide back to the ground, her clothes hissing against his. "How long have you been here?" Finn shrugged. "Not long. Not long," Genevieve repeated as she turned back to the half-filled basket. She continued organizing it as she added, "You weren't lurking in the shadows watching me work." Finn crowed a laugh. "I don't lurk." "Oh yes you do." "I do not." "You were totally lurking." Genevieve elbowed his arm. "Creeper. Better a handsome creeper than an ugly one." And besides, Finn bit his lip and whispered against the shell of her ear. "Maybe I can't resist staring at you." Genevieve flicked those dark eyes up at him, a knowing smirk playing against her lips. That sort of look was sure to set his blood on simmer, but he forced himself to remember the plan. Fetch Genevieve. Go to their favorite place. Propose. Maybe kiss a little bit, okay, maybe more than a little bit. Dinner. It was a simple list and easy to remember, so long as he didn't get distracted. But it was very hard not to get distracted. For a wild moment he wanted to drop to his knees right there. The ring was in his pocket. He could do it right here, right now. But no, he had a plan and there were things he wanted to say to her first, so, not yet. Besides, anyone could walk in right now and he knew she'd always wanted her engagement to be private, just between her and her man as she'd once put it. Finn nodded toward the various baskets. "So what are you working on?" "There are some families in need in the outskirts of the village," Genevieve replied, sultry look disappearing as she twisted a loaf of bread to make room for a few tomatoes. "I headed up an idea to collect extra food and give it to them so they don't go hungry." Finn's heart swelled. He wondered if she knew just how amazing she was. "That's really nice of you." "Well, I can't stand the thought of sitting at home in comfort with more than enough food knowing that they have none," Genevieve said quietly, finishing off the basket and moving on to the next. Finn ducked his head and kissed her cheek gently, content to rest his chin on the top of her head and watch her work. "How many more do you have to make?" Half a dozen or so." He winced. He didn't want to wait that long. "Need some help?" A smile ghosted her lips as she grabbed a few baskets and moved them closer to him. "Have at it." "Sweet." Finn copied her movements, filling the baskets with the various ingredients as she had. While they worked, Genevieve talked about her day, and he watched her as she talked. Her hair was half down today, multiple stray curls framing her face. She wore a scarlet shirt with a scoop neck that showed off her collarbones and thin neck. His Fortis necklace hung from its leather strap. His eyes slid downward toward the comfortable brown pants and boots with a thin braided belt tied loosely around her waist. It didn't matter what she wore or what time of day it was, Genevieve was the most beautiful woman he'd ever known, and he loved her. He didn't realize he was staring until she looked up mid-sentence and her dark eyes narrowed. "What?" Genevieve asked, stepping back to look at her clothes. "Is there something on me?" "No," Finn said quickly, watching as her dark eyes narrowed. "You're checking me out." "Well, yeah." Genevieve laughed outright, either at his open honesty or that he had no comebacks and couldn't even deny it. "You're ridiculous. Only for you, love." Fighting a grin, Genevieve bit her lip and returned to her basket. "I do love it when you call me that." Finn couldn't hide the broad grin if he tried. He gave a long curl at her shoulder, a playful tug. "What is with you today?" Genevieve asked. Finn shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "What is with me every day?" "True, but this is different. You're not usually this affectionate." "Sorry, beautiful girl on the mind." Genevieve grinned. "Okay, what's going on?" "Nothing." Finn laughed. "Can't I think about you without getting grief?" "I suppose so. You're just acting weird." Heart pounding, he shook his head and finished his basket. "Starting another," he said, "I'm just in a really good mood." Obviously Genevieve's eyes sparkled as she looked up at him. She blew a stray curl out of her eyes. "I just have a hard time thinking that I'm the only thing that's making you so happy right now." Finn's smile faded ever so slightly, open honesty taking over his expression. "You're the only thing that makes me happy, Jenny." Genevieve looked up at him with a sappy smile and he looked away with a laugh. She had to suspect why he was being so weird today. She was right, he wasn't usually this sappy. He needed to get a grip. He didn't want to propose to her in a barn over cheese and apples. "Almost done?" Finn asked, finishing his last basket. "Yeah, almost." Genevieve nodded, topping off the basket with a wedge of cheese and some biscuits. She dropped a clean cloth onto the top and slid the basket beside the others. Turning to Finn, she pulled him down by the shirt and kissed him. "Thank you." Finn kissed her again, tilting her chin up with both hands so he could capture her mouth more easily. She sighed against him, allowing him to turn her against the edge of the table. Without breaking the kiss, she planted her palms on the table and hopped onto it so they were nose to nose. Her hand slid around his neck and twisted into his hair. He bit back a groan. She slid her calves around his legs and pulled him impossibly closer even as she coaxed his mouth open with teasing kisses until he opened for her, until her tongue swept across his and all he could think about was her. Gods, one day she'd be the death of him. He could have kissed her for hours and still wanted more, but perhaps it was a message from the gods themselves that reminded him of his mission and why he'd sought her out to begin with. Their lips separated with a loud pop, breaking the silence of the barn that now seemed deafening. Finn tried to catch his breath, which proved difficult with her lips skimming his jawline. "Jen. H.M." Genevieve hummed, nuzzling the skin below his ear. Finn forcefully turned his face toward hers and nudged her up with his nose before she drove him completely insane. Do you want to take a walk?" Genevieve blinked, a look of surprise cutting through the haze. "Take a walk?" He blinked, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's a nice day out. We could look at the sunset." She raised an eyebrow up at him. "I should think I'd rather be in here with you all alone than out there where probing eyes might see us." Finn swallowed hard. If he was being honest with himself, he did too. But he had a plan and a schedule and he had to stick to it, or they'd be late to their engagement and the surprise dinner her father was currently planning, all of which she had no knowledge about. "Yeah, as much as I'd love to stay, it's getting a little hot in here," Finn murmured. Genevieve gave him the stink eye, dropping her hands from his shoulders. "HMPH. Well, not that that's a bad thing. This wasn't going as planned." "No, it's all right. We did agree not to get too carried away after all." Genevieve sighed heavily. She slid from the table and straightened her shirt. She tried for a smile and said, "A walk sounds nice." Finn held back a frown of dismay. That hadn't been it at all. He felt really bad for making her feel like this, because in the past he'd never choose a walk over his completely hot, extremely kissable girlfriend, but he knew she'd understand soon. Taking her hand, he kissed her forehead. "Don't worry, we can continue that later." "HMPH. Genevieve said again, leading the way out the door. Finn followed her without another word, heart pounding with anticipation. Hand in hand, they strolled across the street between a few houses and took the nearest dirt path leading into the woods where they often walked. Genevieve was quiet for a few minutes, but soon she was gazing up at the tangerine and pink sky with a beatific expression. She pulled his arm over her shoulders and tucked herself snugly against his body, wrapping her free arm around his waist even as she twined the fingers of her free hand around his own. Gods, he loved this girl. You're very smiley today. Finn breathed a laugh. I told you, I'm just in a good mood. Genevieve brushed her curly hair out of her eyes. Why? Because today is a special day, Finn hedged, trying to drop hints without being obvious. Genevieve was curious and loved surprises, which meant his job was both easy and difficult at the same time. She was smart, but luckily she didn't put two and two together right off the bat if she didn't have enough information. His lovely girlfriend pursed her lips in thought but shook her head. Why is today special? You'll see. Finn squeezed her shoulder, guiding them around a particularly large boulder. Though having the weekend off certainly adds to it. Snuggling into his chest, Genevieve smiled mischievously up at him through her lashes. Why can't you just tell me? Because that would ruin the surprise. Genevieve sighed, clearly trying not to get impatient with his cryptic words. Finn pecked her temple. We're almost there. I know, we're going to our spot, which is where we always go when you visit. Yup. Did you bring something and set it up? Maybe. Finn. Jenny. Tell me. No. Ugh. Genevieve frowned. He tried not to show it with his goofing off, but in truth, Finn was nervous. Just as he'd been so nervous to leave Burke and visit her that first time, he was so incredibly nervous, he could feel butterflies in his stomach. He was very excited too, of course. He'd dreamt of sharing this moment with Genevieve for countless months now. It had taken lots of planning to get to this point, and now that it was happening. Finally they arrived at their little clearing, which overlooked the hillsides of Jut and stretched out across the ocean. The sinking sun cast an orange glow across the sky, giving them the perfect view. She'd always loved a perfect sunset, so he hoped it was perfect enough. He thought of their first adventure together. Their first date, he'd joked. She'd scoffed and blushed at the idea, calling him a flirt for being so forward. But it almost had been their first date. They'd strolled through the woods and he'd listened to her sing in the caves, her hand tethering him to the world as he remembered what it felt like to be in a dark, cold place. She'd been his tether for a while now. For so long he'd thought it impossible to find someone, anyone who would ever look at him and see him for who he was, not judge him for his emotions or the things he'd been through. For the things he'd done. Genevieve had been a gift and a blessing. She'd healed his broken heart, filled those cracks in ways he'd never thought possible. And without intending to, it had all started on that first deep conversation on that rock right over there, when she'd asked him what it meant to be free and told him what she wanted to do with her life. Suddenly he'd seen the opportunity he had, ripe for the taking. To show her what freedom was like, why he took advantage of every breath, every step, every decision he made on his own every day. Why he brooked no arguments with those who didn't deserve it, and why he fiercely protected those he loved. Because he'd been loved fiercely and had been protected. He'd been wounded and mistreated, yes, but he'd also been so loved. She'd heard all of this, his life's story, and not wavered. She hadn't shuddered. And somehow, day by day, their lives had twined together, Genevieve growing into the woman she was meant to be with a nudge of encouragement from him, and somehow healing his soul in the process. And he wanted to share his life with her. From now until forever, until the gods took him. Finn exhaled a little shakily. Apparently he wasn't as quiet as he'd hoped, because Genevieve looked up at him with concern. She stopped, halting their walk. What's wrong? He shook his head with a small smile. Nothing. Genevieve looked up at him unsurely. You're nervous. Nervous? I'm not nervous. Finn, stop. She looked up at him. What's wrong? He stared into her eyes unwaveringly. Nothing, Jenny. Nothing at all. Then what is it? Genevieve asked. Finn breathed a small laugh, looking down at their hands, his heart in his throat. Genevieve stepped closer, her blonde hair alight with the orange glow on the horizon. She stood beneath his gaze, dipping her head to make eye contact. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I love you, Jenny. Finn whispered. Genevieve smiled, breathing a laugh. I know, Finn. Is that what you're worried about? Finn laughed, trying to grasp some form of control and spit out what he'd mentally planned for days straight now. No, of course not. I just wanted to say it again. With a smile, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently. The gesture was so soft and sweet, so calm, so Genevieve, it gave him courage. When she lowered back down to her own height, she smiled up at him and strolled across the open space. Finn watched her walk around, watching the sun set. He took a moment to catch his breath, gather his thoughts, and check his pocket for the 40th time since they left the barn. He joined her by the rock. Jenny. Genevieve turned, eyebrows raised. Yes. Finn swallowed again and decided to just go for it. With a deep breath, he said, I have to start thinking about the future. He watched her carefully to weigh her expression, but other than the slight rise of her brows, she didn't make a move to comment. He continued, You're my best friend. I've been through a lot and, despite all of that, you've never given up on me or treated me differently. You're kind and patient and you love to help people. You've helped me heal in ways I didn't even know I could after losing so much. Genevieve gave him a small smile and stepped closer. And you've done more for me than I ever would have dreamed. You opened my eyes to a whole new life. Finn took her hands in his own, so small and delicate, fit for painting and playing music. For a moment he wondered if she deserved better. But no, he didn't give that horrible, selfish thought 1 inch and said, we balance each other. You soothe my dull edges and I gave your boring life character. Genevieve gasped and withdrew her hands before pushing his chest. You are so rude. He laughed and closed the space between them again. I'm sorry, I had to. Truly he did, what with the nerves flowing through his stomach again. No, but seriously. Genevieve pursed her lips expectantly, teasingly. I want to make you happy more than anything. I want to protect you and be there for you and raise kids with you. He smiled with her at the admission. I've never wanted to do anything with anyone as much as I do with you. I love you, Jenny. Tears began to well up in her eyes and she quickly rubbed them away with a laugh. Finn. I'm going to be chief one day, Finn continued, brushing her hair out of her eyes with his fingers. And I've never met anyone more kind or selfless than you, nobody else has ever matched me like you do. I can't see any other woman in the world standing by my side to lead my people than you, Jenny. Genevieve laughed again, still speechless. Her dark eyes glittered with tears in the sunset. She'd never been more beautiful than in this moment right now. So. Finn stepped back once and got down on one knee in front of her, still holding her hand. Genevieve gasped, eyes wide, her other hand flying to her mouth. As if she truly hadn't seen this coming. Finn fought a grin as he dug a hand into his pocket. Even with that speech, she was still shocked that this was where he was going with it. Everything in their relationship had led them to this moment, to this final question. Genevieve Sullivan, Finn said, holding up a beautiful golden ring that he'd designed himself and his father had crafted. I love you with my entire being. Will you marry me? Genevieve closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, instantly nodding. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. A grin exploded across his face as he stood and pulled her into the biggest hug he'd ever given her. Her arms were tight around his neck, and she laughed when he lifted her clear off her feet and spun. His heart raced in his chest almost painfully, but he didn't care. She said yes. He loved her more than anything and one day, she was going to be his wife. He'd become chief and they'd lead Burke together and they'd have kids and have all sorts of crazy adventures. He was so excited he had to keep himself from crushing her. When he stopped spinning, Genevieve pulled back, tears still falling as she held his face in her hands. I love you, fearless Finn. His eyes burned even as she pulled him down by the shirt and kissed him passionately, her tears wetting his cheeks. He couldn't stop smiling after they pulled apart. Oh, here. Finn opened his fist and held up the ring. She held out her left hand and he slipped it onto her ring finger, where it not only fit perfectly, it glowed in the beautiful sunset just like she did. Finn kissed her again. Gods, I was so nervous. Genevieve laughed and hugged him tightly. Well, be very glad, you won't ever have to do that again. Finn grinned again and kissed her head. I love you. I love you too, Finn. She kissed him again and slid her hands down his chest, stopping to admire the ring. You made this. My dad did, but I thought up the design. Where did you get the diamond? Local jewel shop. Ah, how convenient. Genevieve grinned. Lots of convenient things came from that treaty. Finn crooned. Genevieve smiled up at him through her eyelashes in a way that made his heart leap. Then suddenly she gasped, I have to tell my family. Oh, they're already waiting for us, Finn smirked, taking her hand once again and leading her back down the path. Huh. Yeah, so your parents insisted that we have a celebratory feast for our engagement, Finn explained. Oh no. It'll be fun. Yes, but do we have to go so soon? Genevieve asked, leaning into his shoulder. He barely caught her mischievous look before she added, we've barely celebrated ourselves. Finn snorted. Naughty girl. You've been a terrible influence, I must say. A terrible influence, Finn asked, nuzzling her neck. Or bringing out the best in you? Oh gods. Genevieve sighed, making him laugh. Wait until after the wedding, handsome. Finn choked on his laugh, trying to return his thoughts to less scandalous ideas. For now, they had a party to get to, and he couldn't wait to celebrate his engagement with his brand new fiancée. When the doors opened to the town hall, fearless Finn marched down the aisle hand in hand with Genevieve. He held up his right hand holding her left, and the crowd exploded into cheers. Chief Kiev had never seen his daughter look so happy as she looked up at her new fiancé. Vikings around the room pounded their cups against the tables as the couple reached the center of the room, where Finn gently pulled his baby girl into his arms and kissed her right there for all the world to see. More cheers exploded throughout the room. Kiev clapped and accepted a kiss on the cheek from his wife and even winked knowingly at Ivan, whom he'd told ages ago that these two were right for each other. His son smiled and laughed with a shake of his head. Kiev caught Hiccup's eye from nearby, all the Haddocks and Larsons having arrived after Finn as a special surprise. Hiccup gave him a knowing grin. As if they hadn't schemed and plotted this union since the beginning. Astrid beamed with pride, her blue eyes bright. Adriana and Eric grinned, Darren gazing about the room in Eric's arms. Cliff whooped, his hands cupping his mouth as Finn and Genevieve separated at last. Finn held Genevieve so carefully like she was a precious gem that needed to be handled carefully and lovingly. Like she was priceless. Genevieve smiled up at him like he was the entire world she stood on. With Finn by her side, she had nothing to fear. And what better man to marry than fearless Finn Haddock? Kiev wiped a small tear out of his eye, even as his daughter turned about the room and beamed when she saw him. The crowds parted for her as she walked to him and threw her arms around his neck, kissing his cheek. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweetheart. Kiev kissed his daughter on the forehead chastely before releasing her to see her mother, and turning to Finn. He'd never seen the boy look happier or more relieved than he did now. I won't say I told you so. Finn laughed and held out a hand. To new unions. Kiev grasped his hand and shook firmly. To new family. Cheers erupted across the hall once again as Genevieve hugged her new fiancé, properly ensconced in his arms. Kiev turned to the crowd and clapped his hands. Let the feast begin. Hiccup gazed at the arena below, curious about the large pile of weapons in the middle. Tall stone platforms had been wheeled in and placed on the massive stone floor, providing a similar layout to what he and his friends had trained in as kids, way before he'd befriended Toothless. Except while those walls were tall and narrowly thin, these walls were blocky and sturdy, good for climbing and scoping out territory. The perfect layout for the rite of betrothal. The Jatans, he'd soon found out, had a tradition with official betrothals, particularly for those of royal blood. The two clans whose children were set to marry would participate in a public event. The young man's victory or defeat symbolized his ability or inability to be worthy of the opposing clan's maiden's hand, and therefore prove if he was ready to become a head of household. Kiev had assured them this was purely for amusement and tradition now. Their ancestors would disband any betrothal if the man lost, but that had not been practiced in years. Strictly for funsies, as Thuggery would say. So basically Snot Loud said. Finn has to beat Thuggery to a pulp to officially win Genevieve's hand. Well, the first to conquer the other side wins. A mock battle if you will. Kiev said. As the Haddock clan is so small and my own clan so large, Thuggery and Finn have each chosen their teams to represent their side. I don't think it would be fair for Finn and Adriana to fight all of my boys alone. I don't know, Kiev Finn said from nearby. I'd love to see my sister break Callan's nose. Hey, Callan Sullivan crossed his arms. I have no doubts in Adriana's abilities in a fight, but it's you we're here to inspect, not her. Amen. Adriana said from her seat nearby, Darren in her lap. In the meantime, please try not to break my husband. Eric rolled his eyes, tightening the straps on his prosthetic. I'll be fine. Hiccup peered around at the gathered group. Finn and Thuggery had each chosen 6 people to fight on their team. Callan, Thuggery's second, looked exactly like Molly with his dark curling hair. He was joined by 4 other young men, all of whom were armed to the teeth. Finn had chosen his own assortment of warriors in training. Eric was naturally his second, and they were joined by Helga, Evan, Thorin, and Kylan. Hiccup had blinked at Finn's choice of the small thin girl, but Finn had merely smirked. As if he knew something Hiccup didn't. Hiccup frowned at the quivers leaned up against swords and other weapons, all sitting in the middle of the arena. So how is this mock fight supposed to work without killing anyone? It's a mock fight in name only, Thuggery said. The weapons are as real as our fists. Hopefully nobody will lose any limbs. Well, any more limbs? I'm looking at you, Larson. Careful, Thuggery, Eric said. Being kicked by a hunk of metal is never pleasant. Probably, but I'd hate to call you Stumpy in the future if you end up losing both legs. Anyway, Callan interrupted, lifting a quiver and withdrawing an arrow. The arrowheads have been replaced with sacks of colored powder. Each side gets a different color, red for Haddocks, blue for Sullivans. When struck, the little powder bag explodes. Eric lifted one of the arrows to inspect the weight, his brow creased. He said nothing though and handed it back. All right, into the ring with you all. The crowd is getting restless. Kiev said, striding toward a set of stairs that would lead him up into the stands. Hiccup watched the 2 teams file into the arena before following. He took a seat beside Kiev's on a raised platform, the rest of their families sitting around them. Cheers sounded from the gathered crowd, mostly Jatan. Many Burkians had come for the celebratory feast and rite of betrothal, however. He could hear Rough Nut and Tough Nut jeering nearby with Snotlout and his twin sons. Fishleg's excited voice could be heard beneath the cheers, spouting statistics and comparing brute strength with cunning between those fighters now squaring off in the arena below. Finn and Thuggery's teams were standing on one side of a line drawn in white chalk on opposite sides of the arena. None of them had any weapons, all having been disposed of in the center pile. Sunlight gleamed off of silver daggers and swords. 2 wooden bows gleamed, tucked safely inside quivers. Cheering rose up in the crowd and Hiccup looked around. He soon realized why. Genevieve strode down the center of the arena, her hair done up in a crown around her head. She wore a floor-length white dress with long, flowing sleeves. A braided belt of gold hung around her hips, matching the strands of gold woven through her hair. A chorus of oohs and ahs replaced the cheers and Genevieve blushed as she approached the dais. A quick glance at Finn had Hiccup choking on a laugh. His son looked like he'd dropped to his knees in supplication. He took Astrid's hand and gave it a squeeze, remembering that it was just yesterday that he'd been the same way about her. Still was, actually. Genevieve took the stairs and took her father's hand. Kiev held her hand aloft atop of his, every bit a king before his throne, though retired. Even though this whole thing was purely traditional, Hiccup couldn't help but take the symbolism seriously. Gentlemen, Kiev said, the crowd hushing around them. Then he glanced at Finn's side of the arena and added, oh, and ladies. First time we've had female fighters for such an occasion, you see. A chuckle passed through the crowd. Today we celebrate the coming union of fearless Finn Haddock to my daughter, Genevieve Sullivan. But first, as tradition demands, he must prove himself worthy. A long drawling yawn sounded down the line. Hiccup leaned out of his chair just as Astrid whipped around. Both of them glared at Snotlout, who merely smacked his lips and smirked back. Heather slapped his arm. To your marks. Hiccup faced forward just in time to see the nearby guard swing a mallet into a gong, which crashed with sound through the arena. The two teams bolted forward, Finn and Thuggery two of the first across the line and raiding the weapon pile. To Hiccup's surprise, Finn grabbed one of the quivers and tossed it over his shoulder without looking back. Eric snatched it out of the air and darted down one of the stone aisles, Kylan on his heels. An arrow slammed into the stone over their heads, blue powder exploding. Just missed. Thorin knocked aside the archer on the other team and one of the other fighters retaliated. In moments the whole arena seemed to be chaos, multiple duels going as fighters scrambled for weapons and tried to get an advantage over the other, all while the crowd erupted in cheers and screams. Finn and Evan had swords and were dueling Thuggery, who seemed more than capable of keeping his foes at bay. It wasn't easy fighting two at once. Helga's twin daggers flashed in the sunlight as she took on Callan, who grinned and seemed intrigued by this new opponent. "This is crazy," Adriana said over the din. She bounced Darin on her knee, unaware of the long stream of drool hanging from his fist. He seemed properly distracted by the fight and completely unbothered by the noise. "Where are Eric and Kylan?" Hiccup shrugged. Maybe he didn't want to get caught in the bloodbath. Thuggery spun around Evan, who nearly ate dirt when the butt of Thuggery's sword went crashing into his upper back. A gasp of sympathetic pain echoed from the crowd, but it was lost as Thuggery launched into combat with Finn. Finn backpedaled, clearly not anticipating the speed of the attacks. He quickly gave up ground, meeting Thuggery's hits blow for blow until their swords locked at the hilt. Thuggery kicked him in the chest and sent him staggering back. Finn's gasp of pain wasn't faked as he stumbled. Genevieve gasped. Hiccup winced, wondering if that old stab wound flared up. But Finn had given up so much ground and they hadn't been fighting long. Now he was half cowering, looking as if he was in genuine pain. Astrid leaned forward. "Is he all right?" Thuggery's fire for the fight seemed to dim and looked as if he was about to ask the same question. Then an arrow struck him in the chest, red powder exploding in his face. Finn gave a triumphant grin, all pretense of pain disappearing before he launched back into the fight with a very surprised Thuggery. Multiple heads turned, looking for the other archer. Hiccup gaped at the sight of Eric perched atop one of the stone walls, a second arrow notched. "How the hell did he get up there?" Snotlout demanded. "I have no idea," Hiccup said. But. Kiev sputtered. "There are no ladders." "How?" Adriana laughed. Eric fired another arrow, too fast for them to see. At a shout from Thuggery, Callan dove to the ground. Red exploded on the cobblestones right where he'd been standing. "Get him, go!" Thuggery shouted. Two of Thuggery's teammates sprinted around a corner. Eric had gotten up there somehow, perhaps with Kylan's help. The small blonde was nowhere to be found, but the crowd on the opposite side of the wall seemed to be cheering. He wished he could see what was happening over there. But it was brilliant, he realized. Finn and Eric had planned this out ahead of time. Draw their enemies in close and then hit them hard. He wondered whose idea it was. But the organized fighting, the way Thorin and Evan had Finn's back despite the injuries they'd already sustained, Helga picking off any stragglers, and Eric's sharp shooting. A fully trained unit of fighters. And they'd been training and fighting since they were young teenagers. Suddenly Hiccup felt a new level of respect for his son. These were the kids who had ganged up against their village and torn it apart a few years ago and, despite himself, he could admit that even back then they'd been a force to be reckoned with. And now, years later, it seemed Finn had never forgotten what good assets his friends were. Their skills, their roles in fighting. Only now they were all directed properly and had learned to use those skills for a better cause than any gang. Finn would make a fine chief one day. And he already had a team to back him up. If the look of pride on Genevieve's face was any indication, she already knew this to be true. Eric fired another arrow, this time hitting true. One fighter went down with a shout, more of surprise than pain. Suddenly Eric looked over his shoulder and then was running across the stone wall. In moments Hiccup realized why. One of Thuggery's fighters had found his way up and was sprinting toward him. And the second wasn't far behind. "Oh gods," Adriana said. Noticing the second fighter climbing onto the platform, Eric knocked an arrow and let it fly, hardly breaking stride. The fighter flinched as a red cloud exploded in front of him. For a moment he disappeared from sight. Stashing his bow back into his quiver, Eric kept running. Clearly the only part of the wall to go back down was occupied. Hiccup found himself gritting his teeth, wondering where he was going to go. Eric's gaze was downcast as he ran, likely focusing more on his balance than evading his opponents. He knew they were going to catch up. But it was better if he didn't fall off the wall. Adriana hissed through her teeth as the opposing fighter closed in. He raised his weapon in a battle cry. At the last second Eric spun, drawing twin daggers out from the sheaths at his belt and caught the weapon overhead. He parried the blow, still giving up ground as the Sullivan fighter pressed his advantage, but Hiccup sat forward in his chair. When had Eric learned to fight like that? His training with Finn has paid off, it seems, Astrid said, pride filling her voice. The silver daggers flashed in the sunlight. Eric met the fighter blow for blow, slowly giving up ground, but the other fighter was gaining, coming in from the opposite direction. He'd be hard-pressed to keep them both at bay from opposite directions. Face set in grim determination, Eric suddenly rushed forward, daggers slicing and jabbing. His opponent backed away, but even on the defensive, there was little use. There was no time as the other fighter finally caught up, his face and clothes spattered in red powder. Slashing out with his dagger, the first fighter leaped back to dodge the blow. Without breaking stride, Eric ducked and caught the other fighter in the middle, easily and flawlessly flipping him over his shoulder. The man hit the stone wall with a loud groan. Eric didn't stop to inspect his handiwork. He turned and sprinted toward the edge of the wall, sheathing his daggers as he went. He leaped off the edge, drawing out a shout from Adriana and many in the crowd. He landed on a smaller ledge some feet away and rolled, though the snap of metal cracked through the arena. Eric gritted his teeth and came up with another arrow, knocked, somehow drawing the bow and arrow as he rolled. He twisted and aimed at the fighter who'd tried to follow. The man skidded to a halt at the edge of the taller platform, his eyes going wide. Slowly he raised his hands and backed away until he returned to his fallen foe. Eric lowered the bow and got to his feet, but his right leg buckled. He hissed and inspected his prosthetic, though the sounds were lost in the chaos. Hiccup winced. Whether by the height of the jump or the force of the impact, Eric's prosthetic was probably broken. And his face looked rather white. "Oh gods," Adriana groaned. "That was very, very stupid. And yet he's fine," Astrid said, nodding as Eric turned on his knees toward the other group of fighters down below. The two fighters who'd chased after Eric hobbled back to the edge of the wall, but were suddenly blocked by a small blonde girl. She bore no weapons. "Oh boy, what's the tiny girl going to do?" Cliff said from nearby. "Against those two meaty buffoons, she's like the size of a toothpick." Tarin scoffed. "Kyelen's made of tougher stuff." Indeed, the two Sullivan fighters swooped in. They were moving too fast, their heavy weight carrying them too close to the edge as they swiped. But Kyelen was already gone. With a twist, she dodged the first attacker and gave him a shove from behind. He hit his knees with a cry at the edge of the wall. The other fighter swung hard. Kyelen ducked and jabbed her small fists into his chest, right beneath his sternum. The fighter collapsed almost instantly, gasping and clutching his middle. With no mercy, Kyelen slammed a fist between his shoulder blades. He went sprawling, his eyes bulging. Hiccup began to laugh. He never should have doubted her, though he did wonder how one so small could pack so much power. The other fighter got back onto his feet and had barely turned around before Kyelen ducked low and spun, her leg catching him behind the knees. He collapsed onto his back, but not before she tackled him, a small silver dagger in her hand. Hiccup couldn't hear what she said over the din as she leaned in close, but it looked an awful lot like surrender. Indeed, the man looked quite defeated and raised his hands. Placing her free fingers between her teeth, she gave two sharp whistles that echoed over the noise. 2. Hiccup glanced around and realized that most of the Sullivan's team had been walloped. Finn and Evan and Thorin bore the most injuries, blue paint or otherwise, but they seemed to be winning. With Helga fighting at his side, Finn looked triumphant. Until Eric disappeared behind a cloud of blue powder with a shout. The other archer had found him and gotten a clear shot. He collapsed onto all fours from his perch, unable to run with his prosthetic. Or C apparently, judging by the powder covering his face. I don't think Marvin meant to shoot him in the head, Kiev said apologetically to Adriana, who'd leaped to her feet. Finn had whipped around at the sound of Eric's cry. His second, and sharpshooter for that matter, was down. His resolve seemed to harden. With a battle cry, he launched into a fierce set of attacks. Helga joined him with a cry of her own, their weapons flashing. Thuggery and Callan backed off, parrying their blows. Helga caught Callan's sword in her daggers and gave a sharp twist, yanking the heavy weapon from his hands. He ducked her next blows, but slammed right into her upcoming knee. Genevieve flinched with a hiss, but Helga was victorious as she dropped onto Callan's chest with a fierce and wild grin reminiscent of her mother's. Her daggers crossed at his throat. Despite the blood dribbling down his face, Callan slowly lifted his hands in surrender. But the grin on his face was unmistakable. Hiccup realized then that only two were still fighting. All other duels had been stopped one way or another. Everyone seemed to watch Thuggery and Finn now. They were equally matched and faced off with brutal efficiency. Every attack, jab or swipe was blocked, parried or dodged. Soon Finn's expression filled with a different light, less aggression and more unfiltered joy for an evenly matched, fair fight. With a screech of metal their swords locked, the sharp edges of each landing on the other's shoulder. Finn and Thuggery panted, grinning, yielding to each other. The crowd erupted into cheers, the mock fight apparently over. It probably wasn't supposed to end this way, Hiccup thought as he stood to join the others in applause, but the Jatans didn't seem to mind. He certainly didn't. Tradition or no, he preferred his son to remain in one piece. Genevieve seemed to agree as Kiev pronounced the rite of betrothal over and officially gave fearless Finn Haddock his blessing. She shoved the door open and dropped into the arena with quick steps before her father even finished speaking. She rushed over to her fiancé and brother, beaming at both of them. She moved to kiss Finn on the cheek and then faltered, grimacing at his sweat-soaked face. The cheering died down enough for them to hear his laugh. Finn shook Thuggery's hand and then gave him a hearty shove. "Battle brothers," Kiev said to Hiccup, slapping his arm. "These two will make fine warriors someday." "You forget, Kiev. They already are warriors." "But even in a symbolic mock fight, there's no question how talented they both are." "Indeed." Kiev frowned. "Perhaps you should check on your son-in-law." "Oh, right," Hiccup said, taking the stairs to the ground level of the arena. Adriana, who had left Darin with Cliff and Tarin in the stands, was standing below the outcropping which Eric still lay upon. She was soon joined by Finn and Thuggery, who jumped to try and see his condition. "Are you all right?" Adriana asked. "Babe." With a low groan, Eric rose to his knees and peered down at them with squinted eyes. His face and hair was covered in blue dye, even his teeth. A purple welt seemed to be forming on the left side of his face. "Oh gods!" Adriana squeaked. "Come down, we can clean you up." Eric nodded weakly but didn't move. "Is it your leg?" Hiccup asked. "We can get a ladder." "No." Eric hissed. Setting his jaw, he swung around until his legs were dangling. He was definitely in a lot of pain, but due to the many eyes watching he was doing his absolute best to hide it. Here Finn stepped beneath him and offered his shoulder to stand on beneath his left foot. Eric seemed to debate this for a moment but seemed to agree that this might be the least painful option. And, he probably hoped, the least embarrassing. It was slow progress, but by taking his hands and carefully using Finn and Thuggery as a sort of step stool, Eric was slowly lowered to the ground. He wiggled his prosthetic against the ground and instantly pitched to the side. Adriana lunged forward and caught him around the waist. "Why you had to get so competitive?" she was babbling. "And you broke your prosthetic too." Recognizing the irritation in Eric's eyes beneath the pain, Hiccup intervened. "We can easily make a new prosthetic, Addy. But you fought brilliantly, Eric. All of you did. Well done." A grateful look flickered in Eric's eyes and he nodded in thanks. Finn nodded as well, but he kept glancing down at Eric's leg. "Right," Adriana said, her voice brightening. As if realizing too that Eric wasn't pleased with the criticism. "I've actually never seen you fight like that." Eric shook his blue-tinted, sweaty hair. Finn said one day all that training would pay off. I guess he wasn't wrong. There's a compliment in there somewhere, Finn remarked dryly. Swallowing thickly, Eric said, I taste die. I think the proper term is death, Thuggery said. You taste death. That arrow really addled your brains. No, you idiot. I taste the blue dye. Well, let's get you cleaned up then, Adriana said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and helping him to the stairs. Hiccup watched them go, eyes on Eric's leg. So sensitive compared to his own amputation. Adri has a point. He shouldn't have made that jump, Astrid said in a low voice, but loud enough for Finn and Genevieve to hear. If he's not careful he could hurt himself permanently. He's already hurt permanently, Astrid. The difference is he doesn't want to be weak or defenseless. I think he proved today that he's neither. Astrid nodded. Still, if he plans on doing jumps like that again, then he will need something more durable. Hiccup's mind was already whirling with ideas. Stronger metal, better coils and parts to absorb impact. Finn sighed and slid an arm around Genevieve's shoulders. Well, that was loads of fun. Let's do it again sometime, Sullivan. Genevieve crossed her arms. Excuse me, the rite of betrothal is only supposed to occur once in a person's lifetime. Yes, but I can always make time to pummel Thug into the ground. Ha! Dream big, Haddock. Thuggery grinned and sauntered toward a water barrel that had been lugged in. Finn, Genevieve and many of the other fighters followed. Hiccup surveyed them all. The symbolism of the rite of betrothal was one thing, but he did not miss the very real possibility that these warriors, these kids could be fighting for everything they lived for, possibly soon. If Brandai never showed his face again. Somehow this brought him comfort. Not Brandine. Never him. But Finn and Thuggery were two future leaders of their own villages, and behind each of them stood at least 6 well-trained warriors, each with their own skills. Even if Finn's own team had seemed to take down Thuggeris in quick succession, it was in that classic hooligan way of fighting. Unorthodox, seemingly random, but precise. The Jatan warriors had been quick and efficient and practical. If today was only a minor fraction of the skills held within 2 villages, well. Hiccup didn't need to do the math. If Brandai never did show his face again, and Hiccup had no doubt that he would someday, they would be ready. Hiccup nodded to himself, eyes on the distant horizon. Wherever Brandine was, whatever he was scheming, they'd be ready. He'd accept no other alternative. Chapter 9, Beauty and the Dork. Chapter text. Weddings on Berk were indeed a reason for celebration. The meals were cooked with special care, the decorations hung under the supervision of Gobber, the dragons kept carefully away from the streamers and lines hung between the rafters. Blue and white flags hung with a cursive C and T, signifying the happy couple whose nuptials were coming upon them fast. Berk loved weddings and this one was no different. And yet compared to perhaps the Jatans, weddings were less traditional. The couple made their own decisions regarding dress and decorations and meal plans, even decided where their beloved friends and family might sit. Even the bride chose her dress, as opposed to Genevieve who would wear her mother's dress on her own wedding day. Therefore, Tarin was most displeased when her mother insisted that she wear her hair up in a tight intricate style. Her makeup, simple and lovely, had already been done. Next was her hair. And she refused to let her mother touch it. Mom, Tarin said through a slow exhale. I don't want my hair to be up today. But traditionally Joan Brand said through puckered lips. The bride wears her hair up and only when she is wed does she bring it down. I've been wearing my hair down for over a year. We've been discussing this for a year. Tarin said hotly. Cliff likes my hair down and I like it down. It's going to be down. Tarin. A pale-skinned hand tapped Joan's shoulder as she opened her mouth to argue, her fingers full of Tarin's long auburn tresses. Excuse me. Tarin looked up in surprise at Genevieve, who had a small awkward smile on her face. I wanted to see how things were going. She wants it down, Joan said in a false hushed voice, as if Genevieve, of all people, should understand the importance of propriety. As if Tarin was not sitting right here listening. I told her that it will look much more beautiful up. She won't regret. Tarin lurched to her feet and whirled around. Mother. Joan, Might I please have a word with Taryn alone for a moment? Genevieve asked. Joan pursed her lips. All right. Maybe you'll talk some sense into her. Genevieve frowned as Joan walked away. Her irritation fled with a look of shock when she turned to Taryn. Oh, don't cry. You'll smear your makeup. Taryn huffed, plopping back into her seat and snatching a handkerchief from her dresser drawer. It was no mystery what I wanted to do with my hair today. I've been talking about it for months. So why she insists that it has to be her way, when we are not traditional, is beyond me. It's so frustrating. She looked miserable and frustrated in the mirror and looked away. Today is my wedding day. I shouldn't have to deal with this nonsense. I agree. Genevieve said softly. Her lips pursed in thought, she ran her fingers through Taryn's long auburn hair. What is it about your hair that means so much? Perceptive as always, their General Taryn let out a small laugh. For so long my parents controlled everything I did. Everything I wore had to pass inspection and every hair to be in place, drawn up out of my face. I had to get permission to wear makeup or get my ears pierced or... She sighed through her nose. And then when Cliff and I started dating, things changed. My parents, especially my father, seemed to realize how much they were smothering me. That allowing me to make simple choices like wearing certain clothes or putting my hair down is not harmful. It shouldn't be such a difficult concept. Genevieve smiled. I understand exactly what you mean. Of course she did. Before Finn had entered her life, Genevieve's life had been no different than hers. Restricted by rules and confined to certain places based on her gender and traditions, but at least Genevieve had had joy. For a long time, Taryn had spent countless lonely nights wondering if she'd ever have a life. Cliff had brought her that life. That happiness. He wasn't the end-all, be-all, of course. She never wanted to make him feel like only he could satisfy her needs as a person because that was a lot of pressure. She wanted to support him through life just as he'd do for her. That was the difference with love. Falling in love and choosing to love. But it had been Cliff who'd flung the door open, and it had been her choice to step through it. You know your mom loves you. Taryn sighed through her nose. It doesn't feel like love. It feels like pride and control. Why though? Why does she do the things she does? I don't know. For a long time I thought it was because of my brother, but losing Kurt has nothing to do with my hair. Maybe it's symbolic of the control she needs to have, but I don't know. Maybe you should ask her. Taryn snorted. Now. Why not? Because we're on a tight schedule. Yes, but we certainly have time to fix things with your mom. Taryn's heart was in her throat. I don't think you understand. We'd be opening a can of worms, undoing years' worth of drama. It wouldn't exactly be a 3-minute conversation. Perhaps you're right. Genevieve said. It took a few attempts to get my parents on board with everything I wanted to change. She gave a small huff of laughter. It took Max saving me and Finn for them to realize our bond. Yeah. They sat in silence for a few moments, the tittering of girls in the living room of Taryn's parents' house echoing through the halls. Taryn had had a hard time picking bridesmaids, but she and Cliff wanted an equal number of friends standing with them. Of course he'd picked Eric as his bestest bra, further dismissing the idea of tradition by calling him something as mundane as his best man, as well as Finn and Alton. Therefore Taryn had naturally chosen Genevieve, Adriana and Inga as her bridesmaids. It was a small entourage, but she was pleased. Might I make a suggestion for your hair? Genevieve asked gently. Something that I think you and your mother might like. Taryn met her dark eyes in the mirror. Genevieve was beautiful as always, her long curls half done in what Helga liked to call a fishtail braid. Put her in a white dress and she and Finn could be the ones getting married today. But in the soft periwinkle blue dress she looked just as lovely. All right. Genevieve nodded and called for Joan, who bustled into the room moments later. To Taryn's surprise, she looked defeated. All right Taryn, if you want your hair down then have it down. It's not my wedding day. Taryn blinked. Despite what she'd said before about not wanting to open the can of worms, she said, well, Mom, why do you want it up? Is it really because of tradition or something else? Joan pursed her lips, which she only did when she was trying not to cry. Oh, it doesn't matter. But it does, Taryn said, finally standing. Mom, just tell me. You can tell me. Genevieve watched on in silence, her dark eyes steady and empathetic on Joan as she took a fortifying breath. When you were small, you used to hate your hair. So I always put it up in a bun. It was so short back then that it would stick up in all directions, but you loved it. Joan said, reaching out to touch a long strand of Taryn's hair. Your father and I always knew you'd grow up to be a lovely woman. And drawing your hair out of your face became a habit. Get up, brush your teeth, hair back, breakfast. I guess I never realized how regular it became until suddenly you were a lovely young woman and other rules were thrown into the mix, and it was such a surprise when you wanted to wear it down. By that point, I confess I forgot what was important. Not the silly little rules. But my baby girl was beautiful and all grown up. And she doesn't want her hair up in that tight little bun anymore. And I suppose I just didn't want to let that image go. I always imagined your hair up for your wedding day, so when it was finally down. Taryn's eyes burned. Oh mama. She drew her mom into a tight hug and squeezed her tight. It's still me. I'm just older now. I know, Joan said through tears. I'm sorry if I ever made it difficult for you. I don't like knowing that I made you miserable. Though tears slipped down her cheeks, Taryn squeezed her tighter. I love you, Mom. Hair will change, but this won't. Genevieve was beaming with pride. Cheeky little know-it-all. She grinned, as if sensing Taryn's thoughts. She was so perfect for Finn. Joan pulled back with a sniff and collected herself. Blast it all, we're on a schedule. Taryn giggled, swiping the tears off her face. Indeed. Genevieve stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. I had an idea for Taryn's hair, and now I like it even more. She patted Taryn's shoulders so she sat on the cushioned chair in front of the vanity once more. How about? Well, at least he's got pants this time around. Hiccup said after entering Cliff's house. Cliff looked down at the grey pants with surprise. Well yeah, I can't exactly get married without them. Nah, those come off later. Cliff grabbed a bottle of hair gel and threw it across the room where it smacked Finn in the back. He yelped and ducked out of the way as another bottle of gel flew at him from Eric's side of the room. Hiccup scoffed as he took a seat in a nearby chair. Pervert. Cliff muttered, delicately arranging his hair so that it was less poof and more, well, opposite of poof without being flat, like he'd just gotten out of bed. No bedhead on the wedding day, please. And no poof. What's the opposite word for poof that's not flat? Eric frowned down at his vest buttons. Volume. Yeah, volume. See, I knew there was a reason I picked you as my bestest bra. I aim to please. Finn scoffed, observing himself in the mirror. He had to pay you back for fishing him out of the water somehow. Who else was going to do it? Might have been swept out by the current and lost to the sea, Cliff said. Another poor soul to sleep with the fishes. And the loss of a quiet life to boot. Listen here, Haddock. Hiccup cleared his throat. No bickering before the ceremony, please. Cliff's stomach did a near painful flip-flop. It was his wedding day. His wedding day. With a slow exhale through his mouth he gazed at himself in the mirror. He looked ready, at least. But his skin looked wan, his steel-grey eyes clouded with nervousness. He promptly slapped his cheeks and stuck out his tongue before crossing his eyes, then promptly snorted at his ridiculousness. Better. Ogling yourself in the mirror? Finn asked, coming up behind him before slamming his palms atop Cliff's shoulders and giving them a painful squeeze. I don't ogle, Cliff said, trying not to wince. He looked like he was resisting a sneeze. I scrupulously scrutinize my features. Finn rolled his eyes and dropped his hands. I pray to the gods that Taryn can do something about your vocabulary. Considering she said this morning that Darren looked Larson-tastic this morning, I highly doubt it. Eric said, lifting his leg onto a chair to adjust the straps on his prosthetic. Besides, you don't get married to have your spouse change you. But they do change you. I mean yes, in the good ways. Hopefully. Hiccup said, gazing thoughtfully through his notes. Eric waved a hand and dropped his leg. Yes, in the good ways, but I'm saying you don't marry a person in the hopes that you'll change them into something different than what they are meant to be. Ergo, can you imagine a Cliff without his regular soliloquies or random outbursts of varying intensity, all of which contain a large number of big words that aren't known to the general public? Yes. Finn said without shame. Cliff promptly shoved him. It'll mess up my hair and my clothes, but I'll find a way to shove you out the nearest window. Also, Eric. Go pee, you're monologuing, which means you're stressed, and there will be no pee breaks in the middle of my wedding ceremony. Finn and Hiccup snickered as Eric began to sputter. The door opened with a creak and Alton swept in, his tanned face flushed. Sorry I'm late. I got distracted. Oh? Cliff asked, crossing his arms with a smirk. Does the distraction involve dark hair and blue eyes? Hey, don't be rude, Finn said. The distraction has a name. The men snickered again as Alton flushed a darker shade of red, making his freckles stand out even further. Oh, shut up. It was nothing, just a late birthday present. Cliff said. It was well known at this point that Alton had a thing for Inga. It had been a surprise at first. Alton had kept a tight lid on it, but after he'd made his feelings known and been subsequently rebuffed, Inga had gone straight to her closest girlfriends to discuss this new development. So naturally all the girls had told their male counterparts. He shouldn't have been so surprised, Cliff thought. They'd been best friends for years. He was under the impression that in most close friendships that were male and female, at least one of them would eventually develop feelings for the other. Whether those feelings would be acted on or addressed would depend on the couple. In the situation of Inga and Alton, he supposed only time would tell. If she'd ever be willing to give him a chance. Alton seemed to be handling it with all the grace a guy could possibly muster. He didn't mope or complain. There was a brief period where they hadn't been talking, but Inga had eventually mended things. As far as Cliff knew, everything was the same as it had always been. Spending their free time together while he was home and when she wasn't working. He'd be spending much less time on Burke now though, not with his recent decision to take over Johan's trading business once the old man retired. It couldn't be long now. Johan was still spry for his old age, but he'd been the primary trader for the archipelago for the better part of 50 years. Alton would be expected to dig deeper into the role, which would require more travel and less time visiting Burke. Maybe Inga was just afraid to take that step. Maybe she just wasn't ready for a relationship. Maybe the thought of dating her best friend, let alone long distance, was too strange or difficult. She might be quite astute at 15, but she was still 15. Maybe one day she'd wake up and realize what a great guy she had standing beside her, waiting patiently, hoping silently. Ah, blast his romantic heart. Today was his wedding day, and here he was romanticizing Alton and Inga's non-existent love life. How odd. What? Alton said sharply, glancing in the mirror. Is there something on my face? Now you're good little bruh. What did I tell you about calling me that? Cliff snorted. It's a natural nickname. Quite fitting. Just as I call Eric my bestest bruh, because that's what he is, and I call Finn a party pooper. Hey. Finn whipped around from adjusting his shirt again in the mirror. I'm not a party pooper today. Do you prefer puffed up popinjay? I think your shirt is fine, by the way. I'm looking immaculate for you. Not Jen. All right boys, Hiccup said, snapping his notebook closed and standing. Don't get yourselves all riled up. We're meeting at the Great Hall in about 30 minutes, so finish up. Grandma Ingerman will escort you. We need an escort to the Great Hall. Finn asked. She doesn't trust you four to not get distracted along the way. Cliff is the leader, you see. As if I'd be late to my own nuptials. Hiccup rolled his eyes as he headed to the door. Eric, keep them in line please. Why do I have to be everyone's parent? Eric demanded. Because you're the most responsible and we need Finn to keep his shirt on and Cliff not to get distracted by the colorful streamers. Oh, we have colorful streamers. I rest my case. Wait, Chief. What about me? Alton asked as he tucked in his shirt. Your job is to make sure they don't get past Eric. So I'm a sheep herder then. Cliff gave a mad giggle and elbowed Finn in the ribs. I always wanted to be a sheep. Finn raised a brow but said nothing. Eric looked quite put out. Alton rolled his eyes but seemed to be fighting a smile. Sheep reminds me of a good joke. Sheep remind. Or sheep reminds. Singular or plural? Alton asked as the door closed behind Hiccup, leaving the four boys alone. Cliff blinked. Does it matter? It does. There was a long pause in which Cliff did not know what to say, the joke forgotten. Which was it? Sheep reminds, or sheep remind? Finn gave a heavy sigh. Great job, Alton. You broke him. Anything to spare us from a god's awful pun right now. Hey. It'll come back to me. Ha. His three friends rolled their eyes, Finn so dramatically it was a wonder his eyes didn't get stuck up in his brain. Though he'd practically made it a sport. Cliff had never known anyone to roll their eyes as often as he did. Maybe that was Cliff's doing, with his goofy jokes and dorky humor. But he knew it was playful, Finn's irritation. He didn't stick around with those he had little interest in. They were polar opposites, Finn disciplined and sarcastic and powerful, a living weapon since he was a child. Their future chief. Cliff was dorky and clumsy and was lucky if he could remember to water his plants regularly. He remembered a time when he was a child, he'd see fearless Finn and think he was so cool and wonder how awesome it would be to be friends with him. It had been a long bumpy road, but he'd never thought he'd gain such a loyal and courageous friend. And Eric, gods, he remembered the days wishing that he was brave enough to make friends. Hoping that maybe someday he could have a best friend to have shenanigans with and grow up with. Little did he know the journey that he'd embark on, how his own clumsiness would turn out to be Eric's salvation, and Eric would become his closest companion after Taryn. And if it weren't for Alton, Taryn's biggest supporter, they might never have made it to this day. It had been his final push that had gotten her out the door, toward a life, a new adventure. Toward him. Looking at the three of them, the solid young men that had always been there, Cliff couldn't stop the sudden burn in his eyes. He was suddenly so thankful, knowing these three were a part of his life and that he'd do anything for them. And he'd do anything for them, too. You know I love you guys, right? Cliff said, his voice thick. Finn looked up in surprise. Eric gave him an empathetic smile as if remembering his own wedding day. To his surprise, it was Alton who squeezed his shoulder. You mean more to us than we can convey, Cliff. We wouldn't miss this day for the world. Eric stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug. You know I'm proud of you. Don't ever change. Cliff squeezed him tighter. Thank you. For everything. Eric's face was splotchy when he stepped back. He gave him a once-over and then nodded, as if in confirmation of something. Finn gave a sudden growl of frustration. Gods, you guys stop it. This isn't goodbye. He's just getting married. Cliff looked over in shock then burst out laughing. Finn was scrubbing at his face roughly, his blue eyes bright. Finn, are you crying? No. I'm not. Shut up. Gods, I hate you guys. Alton snorted. Don't mess up your makeup. Ignoring this, Finn cleared his throat roughly then looked squarely at Cliff. Break a leg. Eric rolled his eyes. Nice pep talk, Haddock. I do what I can. A firm knock on the door pulled them out of their laughter. The door opened and Grandma Ingerman stepped inside. Ah, ravishing as always, boys. I shall lavish you with ravishness, milady. You, Cliff. Finn gave him an odd look. You're about to get married. Save your ravishing lavishness for Taryn. Yeah, that was weird, sorry. Grandma Ingerman gave a chortle. Her graying hair was pulled into a tight knot at the top of her head. Her skirts swished as she stepped inside and straightened their white shirts and brushed wrinkles out of their blue vests. Cliff still wasn't sure how they'd managed to get such a bright color, but he loved it. Combined with the dark shoes and belts, they all looked like a bunch of studs. Cliff found himself bouncing on his heels as Grandma Ingerman tried to adjust his vest. The stud muffin is ready to see his cup pie cake. Can we go now? She laughed. The cupcake is getting on her final sprinkles and then it's time. Finn wagged his eyebrows at him over her shoulder. Sprinkles. Oh gods, Cliff thought, forcing his mind on two cute things like puppies and butterflies. He didn't need the word sprinkles altered for the rest of his life. He was quite sure Grandma Ingerman meant shoes or hair sparklers or something, not whatever Finn was imagining. Not that he assumed Finn was imagining. He better not be. At least not with Taryn, but he could think about that with Genevieve. Well, when they were married. Crap. Before he could voice any of these concerns, Grandma Ingerman stepped back and gave them all one final look. Then she clapped her hands. Who's ready to get married? Cliff's hand shot up, then grinned at everyone's snorts. Then he noticed Finn's hand was up too, a broad smirk on his face. He slapped Finn's hand down. It's not your turn yet. Laughing, Finn slung an arm around his neck and dragged him to the door. Love you too, bruh. Adriana could hardly contain herself. She bounced up and down with excitement as the boys approached from the bottom of the stairs. Grandma Ingerman led the way with Cliff and Finn on her heels. Eric and Alton drew up close behind in deep discussion about trade lines. The brightness of the blue jacket brought out the gold in Eric's wavy hair and made his eyes sparkle. Nothing could compare to how he looked on their own wedding day, but this was a close second. Eric caught sight of her looking and grinned. Alton made himself scarce as she approached and pulled him in for a firm kiss. He hummed deep in his throat when she pressed even closer, not caring that the kiss was probably more passionate than was appropriate for public eyes, but she didn't care. He looked fantastic. He looked slightly euphoric when at least she dropped to her heels. What was that for? You look amazing, Mr. Larson. Ah, he said, clearing his throat. None of that now. He smirked. No time. Adriana gave an unladylike snort. You do say such naughty things. Eric pecked her forehead and whispered, later. She felt the promise deep in her bones and gave a shudder. She took his hand and pulled him into the line where their friends all stood waiting. His teal eyes flicked down the sleeveless periwinkle blue dress. At first she'd been unsure when Taryn said the girls could wear different dresses as long as they were the same color. And yet all the girls could when she'd tried on the strapless gown. She'd tried other dresses, but strangely enough this one seemed to be the most comfortable and showed off her new curves that remained since having Darren. With her hair curled and pinned up in a messy style with pearls and a white lace headband, which all the girls wore in support of Taryn, she almost felt overdressed. Her wedding had long since passed, of course. But Taryn would hear none of it, saying that she had every right to look beautiful today. Eric seemed to be enjoying it at any rate. You're staring. Adriana said quietly. His lips quirked and he leaned in close to her ear. You look like a fallen star. Fallen? She asked with a small laugh. How romantic. Fallen stars shine brighter. His breath was warm on her neck and she felt goosebumps prickle up arms. You outshine all the rest. Her chest felt tight, her skin flushed. Suddenly she wished they were anywhere other than there, standing on the windy steps of the great hall, but no. She took a deep breath through her nose and let it out. She couldn't let herself get all sorts of flustered, not right now. Not as she found Cliff taking his mother's arm at the front of the procession and Grandma Ingerman placing her hands on the door. Turning her face up toward his, Adriana whispered, I'll gladly burn with you, Eric Larson. His teal eyes flared and without warning his mouth slanted over hers, warm and needy. He wanted her, she could feel it. But this was not the time nor the place. She set a hand on his neck but he quickly pulled away as the massive doors ahead creaked open. I love you, Eric whispered. More than life itself, I love you. Grinning, Adriana slid her hand down his body to take his hand once more, just as Alton and Inga, both very bright-eared, she belatedly realized, stepped forward. And I love you. With the sun in his eyes and dimples on his cheeks, Eric kissed the back of her hand before leading her into the great hall for their best friend's wedding. That dress. Her hair. The smoky coal under her green eyes. The taste of her in his mouth since those final moments before stepping inside the great hall. It was all Eric could do to not take her hand and find the nearest dark nook and kiss her senseless. Needless to say, Eric was having a very difficult time concentrating. With every moment that passed, he was reminded of his own wedding day. The streamers and decorations were different, the happy couple and guests were different, everything was so different. And yet it was the same. All he could see was Adriana. She flicked her green eyes at him across the dais and gave him a slow smile. God's help him. The door's opening was a blessed distraction. Taryn stood with Clyde Brand at the end of the line, resplendent in a white lace gown. The guests breathed a sigh and even Eric had to admit she was a vision. Cliff lifted his hands to his face, his grey eyes shining. He was grinning brighter than Eric had ever seen. He suspected he hadn't looked any better on his own wedding day. A quick glance at his Annie and he found proud, happy tears slipping down her face. It was all he could do to keep himself planted where he was. Instead, he gave Cliff's shoulder a firm squeeze as Taryn approached. Her dress was made of lace, complete with quarter-length sleeves. It made her look taller. Her auburn hair was half pulled back, any stray hairs curled away from her face. Her hair, which Adriana had mentioned, was something that Taryn had stressed over. The chosen style was lovely however, curled into sharp ringlets down her back and the upper half twisted into what looked like a loose inside-out braid. Taryn's mother, Joan Brand, looked on with pride in the front row with happy tears streaking her face. As Taryn approached the dais, Clyde kissed her cheek, his face pinched with emotion. Taryn took Cliff's hands and joined them. Her face was dry as she handed her flowers, white and pink roses, to Adriana and stared up into Cliff's face. It was soon apparent that Hiccup couldn't do any wedding without choking up. Maybe he too was remembering Adriana's wedding day, or that soft spot for Cliff was just too overwhelming. Finn offered his father a handkerchief just as he'd done at the Haddock/Larson wedding, eliciting a chuckle from those who'd been to both weddings. Eric didn't hear most of what was said. His eyes were still on Adriana across the row. Her eyes were locked on him, drawing his attention further. A squeak sounded from the row of bridesmaids. Adriana blinked down at Ava Thorsten, who was playing with her basket of flowers with rapt attention. Genevieve gave the tiny girl a tap on the shoulder and tapped her lips with a smile. Ava covered her mouth with an adorable toddler giggle and said, "SHHHHHH." Genevieve nodded again in agreement with a grin, perhaps a bit insistently this time. The crowd laughed at something Hiccup said and Eric snapped back to attention. Cliff was biting his lip and blushing slightly, even as Taryn grinned. He was a horrible best man for not paying attention. And yet here we are. After watching you two grow closer together, challenge each other, love each other, I have no doubt in my mind that this was a match made in Valhalla. Hiccup said. I've watched both of you grow up to be kind, generous and loyal individuals, with no shame for being happy and sharing every last pun in your arsenal, and being there for your friends during some of their darkest moments. You've laughed with them and cried with them. You've joined them in their success and you've picked them up off the ground when they were down. And I would say with no small amount of thankfulness that my children had friends such as you, Cliff and Taryn. And so each of us has come to support both of you in the best day of your life, the day you both will be bonded together from this moment forward until death shall claim you. What sort of future lies ahead of you, I don't know, but I do know this, it will be as beautiful an adventure as any, and each of us standing here today will watch on with pride that we were so lucky to be a small part of it. Cliff looked like he might burst into tears at any moment. Oh Chief, that was beautiful. Oh no. Finn whispered. Eric reached out and patted Cliff's shoulder, much to the crowd's amusement. They tittered at Cliff's pronouncement and now chuckled as he sniffed loudly and waved at his eyes. Eric wasn't fooled though. He was thriving off the crowd's laughter. Taryn's eyes were bright, but she grabbed Cliff's waving hand and returned it to hover beside their other clasped hands where it should be. And now, Cliff Smedley, do you have a token with which you'd seal your bond? Finn snorted softly. Alton promptly stepped on his toes. Cliff turned and held out his palm. Eric pulled the ring out of his pocket and gently set it into his palm. Adriana did the same for Taryn moments later, and soon the gold rings were slipped onto each of their left ring fingers. Hiccup asked each of them to recite the vows, which Cliff and Taryn both did with equal excitement. Their voices quivered and their hands were tightly clenched. Eric stifled a laugh. He'd not been to many weddings, but he'd never seen a couple so undeniably excited for this moment. After Cliff's squeaked "I very much do" echoed through the great hall, to much laughter, and Taryn's much more natural response, Hiccup said, "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may now." They're already kissing. Okay. The rest of Hiccup's dry anecdote was lost to a chorus of cheers as Cliff and Taryn kissed. Her fingers were lost in his mane of curls as she pulled him down toward her. Their height difference was adorable. As Cliff would put it, he was the tall to her small. They broke apart and grinning, darted down the dais, practically running toward the doors as their guests cheered and waved streamers. Eric took Adriana's hand and sprinted after them. Moments later they were greeted by a beautiful sunset, bright orange with puffy purple clouds scattered across the sky. Cliff and Taryn were kissing at the top of the stairs. Adriana giggled and turned away just as Finn and Genevieve appeared from the great hall, both of them grinning and blushing at the hoots and hollers being thrown their way. It was their turn to get married next after all. Next came Inga and Alton, her arm looped through his. As soon as they exited the hall though, Inga pulled her arm away from his with an awkward pinch of her lips and strode toward the girls, demanding to know if their dresses itched as much as hers did. Inga was petite like her mother, but she definitely looked more like a teenager than a little girl now. Her dark hair was thick and voluminous in heavy curls, pulled back only with the simple white lace headband. She looked far older and more mature in her blue dress and makeup. Alton gazed after her with a slightly sad look, but it disappeared with a blink. "How long until we eat?" "I'm starving," Finn said abruptly. "Do you love anything more than food?" Genevieve asked. "You, of course." She gave him a sly smile and reached up to straighten his vest. "I do love a man in uniform." "Hey now, your day is coming," Cliff said as he and Taryn joined the group. Both of them were flushed and beaming. Genevieve shrugged, nonplussed. "Just enjoying the scenery." She flung her arms out toward Taryn and they embraced. "Congratulations." "Thank you." The group exchanged hugs and congratulations, knowing full well that if they didn't do so now they would lose their chance. The sound of scraping chairs and tables echoed from within the great hall and they knew the reception would be starting soon. Eric glanced down at Adriana with a pang that he didn't show. They would be announced prior to Cliff and Taryn joining the reception, so they didn't have time to sneak away. Not yet. He'd have to make sure someone had Darren, too. "What are you thinking about with that brilliant mind of yours?" Adriana asked in a low voice so the others wouldn't hear. Smirking slightly, Eric cocked his head at her. Adriana clicked her tongue. "Still. Oh please. Always." She blushed at that and cleared her throat. "Men." Smiling, he reached out and tenderly hooked a stray curl behind her hair. "Beautiful wives. Are you two done?" "We're lining up," Finn said from afar with thinly veiled disgust in his voice. Indeed, they were lining up. Cliff and Taryn were smirking at them from the back of the line. There was just enough space for them to slip between the newlyweds and Inga and Alton. "That was fast," Adriana said, pulling him toward the line. "I guess we're not the only hungry ones." "Well, it would be cruel to leave the bride and groom starving on their own wedding day," Cliff said with a solemn nod as if he'd said something rich with wisdom. "And that's the best part about being in the wedding party," Finn said from the front. "We get to eat first." First in the wedding party, Gobber's voice boomed from inside the great hall. "Fearless Finn Haddock and Genevieve Sullivan." Without warning, Finn swept Genevieve up into his arms, clearly catching her surprise by the sound of her yelp. The chiffon train of her skirt trailed to the ground as he marched inside to a chorus of whistles and cheers. "Maybe I should carry you inside," Cliff said to Taryn from the back of the line. "That would be romantic." Taryn snorted. "I could carry you in and we'd be less likely to fall over." Adriana burst into laughter just as Gobber's voice echoed over the throng, "Eric and Adriana Larson." Eric pulled his cackling wife into the great hall. The sound of that laugh, laced with hiccups, was something he'd never tire of. He hardly noticed the heat of the great hall, the resounding cheers, the streamers being thrown over them as he twirled her in the center of the room and kissed her soundly. Adriana blushed at the catcalls, though her face was still pinched with laughter. He didn't care. But he didn't want to steal his friend's thunder, so he quickly pulled her out of the middle of the room as Inga and Alton entered. Alton smiled and waved at the cheers, but Inga gave a nonplussed salute that set Adriana and Genevieve giggling. And last, but certainly not least, Gobber said from his place beside the largest fire pit. "Our happy couple, Mr. and Mrs. Cliff Smedley." Cliff and Taryn emerged through the massive doors to a shout of applause, far greater than any before. Streamers exploded into the air, cups slammed against the wooden tables, feet stomped, hands clapped. It was loud enough to make Eric wince, but he didn't cease clapping for his best friend, not as they finally made it to the middle of the room and kissed once more. Taryn broke away from the kiss and glanced around at their guests, who were still clapping and cheering. She made an unsure face and looked up at Cliff in confusion, unsure what to do next. Cliff shrugged and said something that said an awful lot like, "Let's give the people what they want," and pulled her in for another kiss. "Ah, look at him, he's a natural," Finn said, elbowing him in the ribs. Eric snorted. The cheering and clapping died down eventually, though it was many long minutes. It finally ceased as Taryn and Cliff and the rest of the wedding party took their seats at the head table, finely decorated with white linen and blue and pink flowers. Cliff lifted a long-stemmed plant with a burst of blue flowers. "How exactly do you get blue flowers? I thought these were usually white." "Normally yes," Taryn said. "But if you put colored dye in the water and let them sit after picking them, eventually the buds turn the color of the dye." "Nice," Cliff said, placing the flower back in the jar. "You ladies did well with the decorations." "Thanks, babe." Pounding on the table suddenly began as Ben the baker and cook approached the table with an entourage of servers, each carrying heaping trays of meats and vegetables. "They must be very excited for dinner," Cliff said. "No," Eric said with a sly smirk. "They want you to kiss again. I hope you brought some lip balm." Cliff's surprised retort was sharply cut off as Taryn pulled his mouth to hers. Cheers rang out through the hall again and Eric rubbed at his ears. "I'm going to be deaf by the end of the night," he said to Adriana. Suddenly her fingers were sliding onto his leg and gripping his knee. Her expression was laced with cool amusement as she looked around the hall, but when her green eyes flicked to meet his, he could see the mischievous look in her eyes. "There are worse things, I suppose." Eric set down his glass of water and reached down to take her hand just as it slid up his thigh. He squeezed her fingers. "Cruel, beautiful woman." Adriana's lips quirked and she pulled her hand from his as Ben the baker approached with a large basket of homemade rolls. Distracted as she was, she didn't quite see the look he was giving her. Or perhaps she was ignoring him. He didn't know exactly what sort of game they were playing with each other today, but it was enough to set his heart racing. The dress, her hair and makeup, the boldness of her touches in such a public setting. He wondered how long he could keep it together before she drove him absolutely crazy. The stifling heat of the hall was like a cloud over Inga's senses as the night wore on. While she was having a good time and the food had been excellent, she really wanted nothing more than to take this infernal dress off. It itched in all the worst places. If she could run to her house and change into more comfortable clothes, she'd gladly return. But apparently that was a big no-no when you were a part of the wedding party, so she bit back the urge. At least the blue dress was pretty. She'd not worn many dresses in her day, but as she'd put it on and Adriana helped curl her hair, she'd blinked in surprise. Gone was the little girl who'd pined after Finn a few short years ago. Suddenly she looked like a young lady. She'd been embarrassed to go out in public wearing the thing. Her father had stopped dead in his tracks when he'd seen her and then gaped between her and Heather with a pinched, wide-eyed expression. As if someone had forcibly removed his tongue. Inga had thrust her nose into the air and walked away. She didn't want to hear whatever comments might be brewing beneath the surface. Her daddy was one of the best men she knew, but he was still brash and unbridled. If she had to wear the dress all day, she didn't plan to carry comments around like an ugly unmatching handbag. Still, it was a strange feeling. Even if it was less comfortable, or perhaps not uncomfortable but just so different from her usual attire that it just felt very different, she felt pretty. It was decidedly not a Jorgensen tray, and yet. And then there was the other matter on her mind, perhaps more pressing than the itchy dress. It was sitting to her left and his brown eyes seemed to flick toward her every few minutes, as if he couldn't help himself. Things had been interesting with Alton since he'd returned. First she'd lectured him at his late arrival, as he was supposed to return a month prior. After laughing himself hoarse at some of the things she'd called him, including, but not limited to, an incognizant oath, he'd given her a quick hug and said he'd missed her, too. Not that she missed him. Or rather, not that she'd admit it in so many words. The truth was simple though. She did miss him. She hated it when he left Burke. They'd grown up together and spent all their time together as best friends always did. And when he was gone it was like there was an empty space at her side that couldn't be filled. And now that he'd accepted Johann's offer to his trading business, Inga sighed through her nose, wishing she was old enough to have something stronger than the sparkling fruit juice being offered. Not that she knew what sort of stronger drink she'd want, but it would fit her mood better than this fruitilicious concoction, as Cliff called it. Alton seemed to be enjoying the party though. Many people wanted to catch up with him as he'd been gone since the end of summer. With a twinge in her chest, Inga wondered how long he'd be gone for the next trip. The oils had been a wonderful gift, a late present for her birthday. He'd also been gone for his own birthday, but her gift seemed much less exciting. Much less pricey, she was sure. Feeling awkward but stubbornly refusing to allow herself to be shallow about the cost of gifts, she'd handed him the small box without preamble. He'd given her a quizzical look before lifting the lid and pulling out from beneath the white tissue paper a leather cord bracelet with sea glass woven into the cord. The pearly whites and turquoise blues had caught her eye and thought it would be something he'd wear, given that the only jewelry Alton ever wore was leather bracelets. If he wasn't wearing the bracelets, he was wearing leather braces, as if he couldn't stand to have his forearms or wrists bare. His wrists were song bracelets or braces tonight, seeing as he too was wearing the wedding attire chosen for the men, with the exception of the sea glass bracelet. It did something to her chest to see that he'd chosen to wear it. Maybe it hadn't been too simple after all. Deep in discussion with Helga as he was, he didn't notice her watching. She almost didn't notice it herself until she found herself appreciating the tanned color of his skin, the freckles dashed across his cheekbones, the windswept look of his auburn hair as if the ocean called to him even now. Alton didn't have a dragon himself, had never seemed to want one for himself, but there was a different sort of untamed beauty about him. He might not take to the skies, but he challenged the seas. That came with its own form of courage. Inba blinked and snapped her gaze back to her glass. That's when she realized the table had gone quiet. Glancing up, she realized they were all staring at her. What? Inga asked defensively. I asked how your training is going. Genevieve asked with a gracious smile. Her dark eyes flicked to Alton for a moment and then crinkled. As if to say, I see you. Fine. Inga said, straightening and fighting not to blush. I helped deliver a baby yesterday. That was fun. Finn grimaced. I can't imagine that being fun. Only because you're a prude. I'm not a prude, Finn said. I just don't know why anyone would want to do that. What? Give birth or help women give birth? Inga asked with a note of challenge. It's no easy feat for either. And besides, it's actually fascinating. Genevieve nodded. It really is. Finn turned to her with surprise. You've seen a birth? No, Genevieve said. I've helped make an elder's passing easier, which is also no easy feat for those caregivers and loved ones. I have not been present for the beginning of a life though. I'd love to see what it is like. As Inga said, I imagine it is fascinating. The human body is a fascinating thing. Finn blinked and looked as if he was fighting a smile. Helga gave a long-suffering sigh. Your time will come, children. Genevieve cleared her throat. Yes, but that is not the same thing as it would be for someone in Inga's position. True, but then he'll basically get to be the observer while you pop out his babies. Oh gods. What? It's true, don't be such a ninny. Helga said, smirking broadly as Finn laced his fingers and looked away with a resolute expression. Soon enough you two will be married and it won't be long before Jens. I may be a healer, Inga interrupted. But can we not? Please? Finn added in a quiet voice. Color had risen to Genevieve's cheekbones in a splotchy pattern. Alton coughed. Speaking of weddings, have you both picked a date yet? At once, Finn's expression darkened. No. Genevieve took his hand. Well, it will be some time, I'm afraid. What's this? Helga sat up, all trace of amusement gone. What do you mean? My father wants us to wait until Finn is closer to becoming chief. Silence took over the table. Finn looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. Clearly he wasn't happy with this, and Inga couldn't blame him. But that could be years, Alton said. Right. Finn said. That's not fair. Helga said. I mean, your dad's not exactly old, and you've already been dating for the better part of 2 years. Yeah, we went over all this with Kiev. Finn said bitterly. But apparently it's a tradition thing. Inga glanced at Genevieve. Her expression was flooded with guilt, as if she felt horrible. Inga knew how much they wanted to get married. She was no expert on the subject, but it seemed sooner rather than later was a better prerogative than when Finn's plate would suddenly be filled with the biggest life change of his life, second only to getting married. Becoming chief would be no small affair. She'd known Finn her entire life. She remembered him boasting as a little kid about how awesome becoming chief would be someday and how he'd get to call all the shots. But as he'd gotten older, he learned what sort of responsibility that would be and how burdensome it would become. He'd make an amazing chief one day, that much she knew. She had no doubts about that, just as she was confident she'd make an apt healer someday. Confidence wasn't the issue. But it was also a burden. He wouldn't be free in all the ways that he liked to be. At least to her, it made more sense to get married and figure out that new part of life before taking on such a large responsibility. Why have to juggle being a new husband and wife and chief all at the same time? And if the sad expression on Genevieve's face was any indication, they'd discussed all this before. Helga reached out and squeezed Finn's arm. I'm sorry. Hopefully it won't be a long time. An encouraging touch from Helga was a rare find. She was the slap or punch the shoulder sort of friend, not the gentle sort of girl. Yet it seemed to pull him out of his dark thoughts and he exhaled through his nose. It'll work out in the end. Thanks. Genevieve shot Helga a grateful look. This, Inga imagined, meant that she'd tried to pull him out of those negative thoughts already and had a tough time doing so. Hey there, summer-looking friends, Thuggery said, slapping his hands onto the table and making them jump. What's eating you guys? I should be asking you that question, Helga said, leaning back in her seat. Her blue eyes skimmed down his embroidered blue tunic which fit him to exact measurements. Not a trace of fat or extra material on you, handsome. Finn gave a snort and rolled his eyes and Genevieve coughed. Thuggery's lips quirked. Looking fine yourself, Miss Ingerman. Indeed, Helga was wearing a yellow summer dress and a gold necklace. She too never wore dresses, claiming that they were too fanciful for one such as herself. And yet she cleaned up nicely. Inga had no doubts that she still had weapons hidden somewhere under her clothes, easy to grab should she need to disembowel the nearest Moran who stumbled her way. Not that she seemed ready to disembowel Thuggery. Inga watched the flirting with raised brows. Alton gave a low snicker and took a sip of his drink. A little birdie told me that Gobbus wine is the finest in all the archipelago, Thuggery said, dark brown eyes unblinking on Helga. Only problem is there are 4 different kinds. Have any preferences? Helga smirked and stood. You know, I was quite devastated to learn your brother Callan is married. But you'll do. Finn choked on a laugh as she took Thuggery's hand and dragged him into the crowd. Thuggery shot them a victorious wink as they disappeared. Well, that's a dangerous pair. Genevieve said. Alton gave a salute with his empty glass. Good luck, Thuggery. Inga snorted with laughter. Good luck indeed. Alton matched her grin with one of his own. Hopefully she lets him down easy. Yeah, well, Inga said, amusement fading. Easier said than done sometimes. His smile faltered slightly. Yeah. Way to go, Inga, she thought. Way to kill the moment. Belatedly she remembered Genevieve and Finn were still sitting across from them, watching with interest. Finn's blue eyes were flicking between them. A knowing smile played around Genevieve's lips, though she was clearly trying to hide it. Uh-oh. A cheer rose up from the crowd, diverting their attention elsewhere. Inga was momentarily grateful as she felt her face flush. She raised her glass of her sparkling juice and frowned as she realized it was empty. "Want to get another drink?" Alton asked. "Yes. No." If she left the table with him now, Genevieve and Finn would begin to whisper as soon as they were out of earshot, she knew it. But she and Alton were best friends, it was nothing new that they followed each other around. If they wanted to make assumptions, if there was anything to assume, that was their prerogative. Lovebirds and their matchmaking. And besides, Thuggery and Helga were probably at the drink table swapping either glasses or spit, and she didn't wish to be a part of that. "Let's check out Cliffy Snackage's table," Inga said instead.